Let your mind drift tonight toward a particular kind of childhood in a particular kind of great English house. Not your own. Picture instead a wide oak-floored nursery on the upper story of a country mansion in Northamptonshire, with tall sash windows looking south over a lake, and two girls sitting on a window seat with their backs to the glass. The elder is perhaps 8, the younger 4. They are sharing a book between them, one of the small leather-bound primers that the children of great Whig families learned to read from in the 1760s. The elder girl is doing the reading. The younger one is listening. There is a governess in a chair over the room with embroidery in her lap, and a fire burning in the grate even in summer because the house is cold, and a maid bringing milk and bread on a tray. The afternoon light is moving slowly over the floorboards. The elder girl, when she finishes the page, turns to her sister and asks her, in the way elder sisters do, whether she has been paying attention. The younger one says yes. The elder one believes her, partly because she wants to, partly because it is easier than not. Imagine those two girls in that room in that hour. One of them is going to grow up to be the most famous woman in England. The other is going to grow up to live a longer, quieter, harder version of the same life in the shadow of her sister, and to outlive her by 15 years, and to die in a hotel room in Florence on a November afternoon in 1821, thinking about both of them. Tonight is for the second one. Wherever you are listening from in the world, there will be a household near you, somewhere, perhaps even in your own family memory, in which two sisters of close ages were raised together as if they were the same person, and then, in adulthood, became two completely different stories, the one whose story the world remembers, and the one whose story it does not. I would love to know if there is such a pair in your own family, or in the family of someone you grew up beside, and what became of each of them. The history of great houses tends to remember the daughter who married up, the daughter who caused a scandal, the daughter who got painted by the right artist at the right time. It tends not to remember the other one, the sister who married a difficult man and stayed married to him, who loved someone she could not have, who had children she could not openly claim, who lived through the death of the famous sister and continued for another decade and a half carrying the family story alone. That second sister is tonight's subject. If you would like to come with me on the slow walk through her 60 years, I would love it if you subscribed, so that you do not miss the next one. Settle in wherever you are. Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we are going to spend the evening with a woman whose name the world has largely forgotten, and whose life, if you set it down beside the life of her elder sister, is the more painful and the more interesting of the two. Her name was Henrietta Frances Spencer. She was born in June 1761 at Wimbledon Park, the second of 3 children of John Spencer, the first Earl Spencer, and his wife, the Countess Spencer, the formidable and devout Georgiana Poyntz, who had been raised in the household of a Whig diplomat, and who would, in her own long widowhood, become one of the most respected women of the late 18th century aristocratic establishment. Henrietta had a brother 3 years older than her named George, who would inherit the earldom in time. She had a sister, 4 years older than her, named Georgiana, who would, in 1774, at the age of 17, marry the Duke of Devonshire and become the most famous woman in England. The story of the elder sister has been told elsewhere, and is not the story of tonight's evening. The story of tonight's evening is the story of the second daughter, who watched her sister be watched, and who married a man who would prove difficult in particular ways, and who took, in her 30s, a younger lover she could not marry, and who would father 2 children whose existence she could not openly acknowledge, and who would, in middle age, watch her own daughter dragged into a public scandal with the most famous poet in England, and who would die abroad at 60, alone with her husband in a Florence hotel, having outlived nearly everyone of the generation she had grown up inside. She was Lady Henrietta Frances Spencer until 1780. She was Lady Duncannon from 1780 to 1793. She was Lady Bessborough from 1793 until her death. She was Henrietta to the family she loved and to the small handful of people who were permitted to call her so. Tonight, we are going to live her whole life with her. From the nursery at Wimbledon Park, where she sat on the window seat as a small girl, listening to her sister read aloud, to the hotel in Florence 60 years later, every decade, every house, every catastrophe, every love, we will spend time with her parents, with her brother, with her husband, with her 4 children, with her lover, with her niece, who became her rival by marriage. We will know her sister Georgiana only as Henrietta knew her, which was as the central fact of her own life until 1806, and as a memory she carried for 15 more years after that. The Duchess of Devonshire's own story, the debts, the gambling, the political campaigning, the long menage a trois with Bess Foster, the catastrophic love affair with Charles Grey, has been the subject of another evening, and the listener who wants Georgiana's story should refer to that script. Tonight we have the other sister. Tonight is for Henrietta. The 2 Spencer daughters at Althorpe grew up inside a household that was, by the standard of mid-18th century English aristocratic life, both formidably wealthy and unusually religious. The Spencers were a family of considerable land, considerable inherited capital, and considerable Whig political connection. Althorpe, the family seat in Northamptonshire, was a brick and stone mansion of perhaps 80 rooms surrounded by parkland that ran to nearly 15,000 acres, and the family also held Wimbledon Park in Surrey, a London house at Spencer House in St James's, and a hunting establishment at Pytchley in the Midlands. The family income in the 1760s ran to something approaching £40,000 a year, which placed them in the top tier of English landed wealth without quite reaching the very highest ducal level. They were Whigs by tradition and by conviction. They were Anglican, but with a serious evangelical edge, particularly on the mother's side. They were the sort of family that conducted family prayers twice a day, that observed the Sabbath with strict rigour, and that raised its daughters to believe that personal religion was the foundation on which a respectable life would have to be built. The mother, Countess Spencer, was the dominant presence in the children's early lives. She had been Georgiana Poyntz before her marriage, a young woman of clever education and forceful piety, raised in the household of her father Stephen Poyntz, the diplomat and courtier who had been governor to the Duke of Cumberland. She had married John Spencer in 1755 in a love match unusual for its sincerity in a family of the Spencer level, and the marriage had been, by the standards of her generation, exceptionally happy. She and her husband shared a deep mutual affection, a serious religious life, and an unusually close interest in the raising of their children, where most English aristocratic mothers of the period delegated the daily care of young children to a nurse and a governess, and visited their children for an hour a day in the manner of Queen Charlotte. Countess Spencer was in the nursery herself for portions of every day. She read with the children. She prayed with the children. She wrote them letters when she was away from them that ran to several pages each, and that contained both genuine maternal warmth and stern moral instruction in roughly equal measure. She did not believe in raising daughters to be ornaments. She believed in raising daughters to be Christian women who would, in their adult lives, conduct themselves with seriousness and self-discipline. This was the household into which Georgiana had been born in June 1757, and into which Henrietta was born 4 years later in June 1761. The two girls were therefore raised in lockstep through the years of their early childhood, 4 years apart, but within the nursery and the schoolroom and the maternal supervision. They learned to read together, with Georgiana the elder and the quicker. They learned French and Italian together, with the same governess. They learned drawing and music together, with the same masters who came in from London or from the nearest market town. They were dressed alike in their childhood years, in the linen frocks of the period, and they were called by the same diminutives. Georgiana was Georgie, Henrietta was Harry or Harriet, and they were treated, in the daily texture of the household, as a pair, but they were not the same temperament. Georgiana, even as a young child, was the brilliant one. She had the quicker memory, the more fluent tongue, the more obvious physical beauty as her face emerged from the baby fat of early years. She was, by the age of 6 or 7, the sort of child whom adults in the household began to single out for the particular notice that some children attract and others do not. Visitors to Althorpe remarked on her. Drawing masters praised her precocity. The Countess Spencer wrote of her in private letters to her own mother as a child of unusual promise who would require careful management as she grew older. Henrietta, 4 years behind, was the quieter sister. She was not less intelligent, but she was less performative. She read books more carefully than Georgiana did, but with less display. She drew with patient accuracy rather than with brilliant suggestion. She was, by the standards of the household, the well-behaved one, the daughter who could be trusted to sit still in church, who did not interrupt her elders, who finished what she was asked to finish. The Countess wrote of her in similar private letters as a child of even temper and reliable disposition, by which she meant that Henrietta would not in adulthood give her mother the sort of anxiety Georgiana was already, at 8 or 9, beginning to give her. The two girls were close in those years. They were friends as well as sisters. They shared their lessons. They shared their meals. They shared in the early years a bedroom. They invented private games and private vocabularies, in the way close siblings raised together do. Henrietta admired her elder sister with the unmixed admiration that younger girls give to slightly older ones who can read better and walk faster and reach higher shelves. She wanted to be like her. She watched Georgiana be praised by adults and understood, slowly, over the years of her early childhood, that Georgiana was being praised for things that came naturally to Georgiana, and that did not come naturally to her own quieter self. She did not resent it. She did not, by any account of those who observed the household, show any of the sibling jealousies that would have been entirely understandable in a younger sister in her position. She loved Georgiana. She wanted, in the manner of a younger sister, to be useful to her. She would carry into the rest of her life the habit of finding her own place in the room by reference to wherever her elder sister was. It was the orienting fact of her childhood. It would become, in different and harder forms, the orienting fact of her adulthood. The brother George, 3 years older than Henrietta, and 1 year younger than Georgiana, was a different sort of presence in the household. He was the heir. He was being raised, even from early childhood, with the expectation that he would inherit the earldom, the estates, the political role, the seat in the Lords. He was educated separately from the girls from the age of 7 or 8, with a male tutor in his own apartments, and eventually sent off to Harrow and to Cambridge. He was fond of his sisters, but he was not, in the daily texture of the nursery years, part of their inner pair. The pair was Georgiana and Henrietta. George was the brother who would in adulthood become the second Earl Spencer and the first Lord of the Admiralty under Pitt, and a respectable Whig grandee of his generation, but he was, in his sisters' lives, a more distant figure than they were in his. His own marriage in 1781 to Lavinia Bingham would produce his children and his own household, and he and Henrietta would correspond warmly over the years, but he would not be the central male figure of her life. Her two close male relationships in adulthood would be her husband, who would prove difficult, and her lover, who would prove the central romance of her life, and who would, in the end, marry her niece. The Spencer parents' approach to the daughter's education was, by the standard of the period, unusually intellectual and unusually demanding. The Countess in particular believed that her daughters should be capable of holding their own in any cultivated conversation. They were given Latin lessons, which was rare for girls of the period. They were taught the rudiments of mathematics. They were given a thorough grounding in history, in literature both English and French, in music both as performers and as listeners, in drawing both as a polite accomplishment and as a serious craft. They were taken regularly to London for the social season and exposed to the full range of London cultural life, to the theatre, to concerts, to picture galleries, to the houses of family friends where they would meet politicians and writers and artists. By the time Georgiana was 15 and Henrietta was 11, both girls had been to Paris, both had been to The Hague, both had spent time in continental courts where their father's diplomatic connections opened doors. They were, by the calculus of the 18th century aristocratic marriage market, exceptionally well-prepared candidates for the highest sort of match. What the Countess had not entirely prepared them for was the marriage market itself. She had raised them to be intelligent and devout and accomplished. She had not raised them to manage the public attention that would attach itself to their adult lives the moment they were married. The Countess herself had been a private woman in a private marriage. She had not foreseen what it would mean for her daughters to be propelled, before they were 20, into the most public marriages a young woman of their period could make. She would learn with Georgiana what such marriages cost. She would learn the same lesson in a different form with Henrietta. She would spend the rest of her own long widowhood. She lived until 1814, into her own 70s, trying to protect her daughters and her grandchildren from the consequences of decisions she had supported in the first instance, and had not, at the time, fully understood the implications of. Georgiana's marriage came in June 1774, 3 months before her 17th birthday. The match was proposed by William Cavendish, the 5th Duke of Devonshire, who was 25, recently come into his inheritance, and looking for a wife of comparable rank and considerable connection. The Spencers were considered an excellent match. The dowry agreed was £20,000, the highest dowry then current in the English marriage market. Georgiana herself was consulted in the proposal, but in the formal manner of the period. She was asked whether she could love the Duke, and she said yes, on the basis of 1 or 2 formal meetings and the assurances of her parents that he was a man of honour. The wedding took place on the 7th of June, 1774, at Wimbledon Park, in a private ceremony attended by the immediate family. Georgiana left her parents' household and entered Devonshire House in Piccadilly as its mistress. She was, on the date of her wedding, 16 years and 10 months old. Henrietta was 13 at her sister's wedding. She attended the ceremony in a new dress and a new pair of gloves and a spray of white roses pinned to her bodice. She watched her sister become a duchess. She returned with her parents and her brother to Althorpe, where the household resumed its country routines, and the schoolroom resumed its lessons, and the daily walks in the park resumed in the company of governess and brother and parents, but with one chair empty at the dinner table that had not been empty before. The empty chair was the structural fact of the next 6 years of her life. Georgiana was gone. Georgiana had become, by virtue of one wedding, a public figure of a kind no Spencer daughter had been before her, and the Spencer family was now, in its London life and increasingly in its country life as well, the family of the Duchess of Devonshire's parents, and the Duchess of Devonshire's brother, and the Duchess of Devonshire's younger sister, and Henrietta would, for the rest of her adolescence, be the sister of someone whose every appearance in public was the subject of newspaper paragraphs and engraved prints sold in the shop windows of the Strand. The transformation in Georgiana's public profile in the year after her marriage was rapid and total. The new Duchess was beautiful in a particular way that the period responded to, with a long oval face and pale skin, and the fashionable height that flattered the dresses of the mid-1770s, and she was placed, by her wedding, at the absolute summit of London society, with no preparation for the role she was now expected to perform. She rose to the role with extraordinary speed. Within a year of her wedding, she was the most copied woman in England. The dresses she wore appeared in the shop windows within weeks. The hairstyles she adopted were imitated by every fashionable woman in London. The gestures of her social manner were studied and reproduced. The newspapers, which were just then beginning to develop the gossip column form that would dominate the rest of the century, gave her an absurd amount of attention. She was 18 years old. She had been the central social figure of the kingdom for the better part of a year. She was, by the time Henrietta turned 15 in 1776, the most famous woman of her generation, and Henrietta was the Duchess's sister. What this meant for Henrietta, in her later adolescence, was that she lived the rest of her own preparation for adulthood inside a particular kind of pressure. Every time she went up to London with her parents, and the family went up to London frequently because Georgiana wanted them there, and the Countess wanted to be near her elder daughter, Henrietta found herself drawn into the orbit of Devonshire House and the Devonshire House set. She was at her sister's parties, at her sister's dinners, at her sister's box at the opera. She met the men who would in time become the central figures of Whig politics in the next generation: Charles James Fox, the brilliant dissolute politician who held court at Brooks's and who was already by the late 1770s the Duchess's close political ally; Richard Brinsley Sheridan, the playwright and politician who admired her from a distance; the Prince of Wales, 6 months younger than Henrietta and the heir to the throne, who would become one of the Duchess's closest male friends, and who would in time also become an admirer of Henrietta's. She met Bess Foster, the woman whom Georgiana would, in 1782, take into her household as her closest female companion, and who would, by the 1790s, become Georgiana's lifelong menage partner in a domestic arrangement that the rest of London understood without entirely speaking of. Henrietta was inside the Devonshire house set from the age of 14 onward, watching it form around her sister, watching her sister become the figure she became, and watching the sort of life her elder sister was now going to live unfold at a pace and on a scale Henrietta herself would not, by her own temperament, have chosen. She did not begrudge it. There is no record, in any of her surviving letters of the period, of jealousy of her sister's position or resentment of her sister's fame. She admired Georgiana. She loved Georgiana. She wrote her elder sister long letters from Althorpe when Georgiana was in London, and she received long letters from Devonshire House when she herself was in the country, and the letters were the letters of devoted close sisters who had not been separated by their different fortunes. What Henrietta did do, in the years between her sister's wedding and her own, was form a quiet, private resolve about the sort of marriage she herself would want to make. She wrote to her mother in 1779 when she was 18, and the question of her own marriage was beginning to be raised, a household less public than Georgiana's. She wanted a husband who would love her in private and not in the newspapers. She wanted, if at all possible, a country life. She wanted to be a Spencer who was not famous. She would not, in the event, get any of it. The marriage she made was to a man whose nominal position was almost as conspicuous as the Duke's, whose social life would draw her permanently back into the same London circle her sister inhabited, and whose private behaviour would prove harder to live with than the public scrutiny she had been hoping to avoid. The Countess, who supervised the negotiation of the match, did not predict the difficulty. The Countess was, in her own judgment of male character, sometimes less perceptive than her religious seriousness suggested she ought to be. She thought Frederick Ponsonby, Viscount Duncannon, was a suitable husband for her quieter daughter. She thought the match would settle Henrietta into a respectable marriage and produce children, and remove her from the daily orbit of Devonshire House, and reduce her exposure to the figures of the set, whom the Countess privately considered a bad influence on both her daughters. The Countess was wrong on every point. The marriage would not settle Henrietta. The marriage would not remove her from Devonshire House. The marriage would, on the contrary, lock her into a domestic situation she would not, by 1789, have been able to escape from without scandal of the kind her mother had been most determined to avoid. The negotiation of the match began in the spring of 1780, when Henrietta was 18 and Duncannon, the Ponsonby heir, was 22. The Ponsonbys were an Irish Whig family of considerable fortune. The first Earl of Bessborough, Duncannon's father, owned substantial estates in County Kilkenny and a fine London house in Cavendish Square. The family income was perhaps £30,000 a year, less than the Spencers, but still in the comfortable upper bracket. The political connection was excellent. The Ponsonbys had been allied with the Whig grandees through several generations, and Duncannon himself was being prepared for a parliamentary career in the family interest. He had been at Harrow, then at Christ Church, Oxford, then on a brief grand tour. He had been presented at court. He had been introduced to Henrietta in the Devonshire House drawing-room in the early months of 1780, in the company of his father and his uncle Leon. John Ponsonby, and the introduction had been arranged by the Duke himself, who had grown up with the Ponsonby cousins, and considered the family a sound choice. The young man Henrietta met that evening was tall, fair-haired, well-mannered, of pleasant if formal address, and entirely correct in everything he said. He did not, at the time of the introduction, show any of the qualities that would, within a year of the wedding, begin to make Henrietta's life difficult. She accepted him after 3 further meetings. She was not in love with him, by her own account in a letter to Georgiana written shortly before the wedding. She thought him agreeable. She thought he would be a kind husband. She thought that the household he would set up for her would be the country household she had been hoping for, because the Ponsonbys had estates in Ireland, and Henrietta had been told by Duncannon himself that he intended to spend a portion of every year at the Irish seat at Bessborough, in County Kilkenny. She thought, in other words, that she had found the marriage she had been looking for, respectable, untheatrical, partly out of London, with a husband she did not love passionately, but who would, she had every reason to expect, be a decent companion. The wedding took place on the 27th of November 1780, in the private chapel at Spencer House, in a ceremony attended by the immediate family and by the Duke and Duchess. Henrietta was 19 years old. Georgiana, who served as her chief witness, was 23 and 3 months pregnant with the first of her own children. Both sisters, on the morning of the wedding, were settled into the lives the period had assigned them. Neither of them, on that morning, had any clear sense of what those lives would actually cost them over the next 40 years. The first year of the marriage was the best of the marriage. The young couple set up house at the Ponsonby property in Cavendish Square, which had been remade for them by the first Earl of Bessborough as a wedding gift, and the household began the ordinary business of an early 18th century aristocratic establishment. Servants were hired, furniture was arranged, the drawing rooms were repainted. Henrietta, who had a quiet eye for the management of a household, took to the practical work of running the establishment with the calm competence that had characterized her in the schoolroom at Althorpe. Duncannon, in the first months, was attentive in the manner of a young husband who had not yet entirely tired of the novelty of having a wife. They dined together. They drove out together in the carriage in the afternoons. They attended the early evening parties of the season together. Henrietta wrote to her mother in February 1781 that her husband was kind, that the house was being slowly made comfortable, and that she was, on balance, content. The first child, William Ponsonby, was born on the 31st of August 1781, 10 months after the wedding. He was a healthy boy. He was the future Earl of Bessborough, the heir to the Ponsonby line, and his arrival was greeted with the formal celebrations the period required. The Countess came up from Althorpe to be with her daughter during the lying-in. The Duke and Duchess called from Devonshire House within the hour of the boy's birth. The Ponsonby grandfather and the Spencer grandfather both wrote letters of warm congratulation. Henrietta nursed the boy herself for the first 6 weeks before turning him over to a wet nurse, which was the standard practice of the period for women of her class, and the child went to a nursery on the upper floor of the Cavendish Square house, with the staff that an heir's establishment required. Henrietta visited him in the nursery 3 times a day in the first months, and at least twice a day for the next several years. She was, by every account that survives of her in the role, an attentive and affectionate mother. The second child, Frederick Cavendish Ponsonby, was born on the 6th of July 1783, less than 2 years after his elder brother. He was named for his father and for the Duke. He was a sturdy infant who developed into a sturdy boy who would, in time, become a distinguished soldier and would survive grave wounds at Waterloo in 1815. The third child, John William Ponsonby, was born in 1785, the same year as the daughter whose arrival would, in due course, transform Henrietta's middle life. The fourth child, Lady Caroline Ponsonby, was born on the 13th of November 1785. The only surviving daughter, the child whose name the world would remember when the rest of the Ponsonby family had been largely forgotten, and the child whose adolescent and adult unravelling would be the great public sorrow of Henrietta's later life. Caroline was a small, dark-eyed, fierce-tempered baby with what the household staff at Cavendish Square would describe to one another, in the way household staff described such things, as a vehement nature from the cradle. She did not, even as an infant, sleep through the night. She did not, in her early years, take to ordinary nursery routines. She was the child Henrietta would have most needed help with, and was the child Henrietta would have the least skill at managing, because the management of a child of Caroline's temperament required forms of patience and discipline that Henrietta herself had never been taught. But that is a later story. In the years between 1781 and 1786, What mattered in the Cavendish Square house was that Henrietta had borne 4 children in 5 years, all of whom had survived infancy, and that the household had its dynastic future secured. The marriage had begun to settle by 1784 into the steady domestic pattern that had been its intended shape, and it was at exactly this point, when the marriage had served its principal external purpose and produced its heirs, that the difficulty of Duncannon's private character began to emerge. The difficulty began as small irritabilities. Henrietta noticed in the second year of the marriage that her husband was sharper tempered in the privacy of their rooms than he was in company. He was inclined to small jealousies over which men she had spoken to at a party, over which letters she had received, over how long she had spent at Devonshire House on a given afternoon. The jealousies were not at first particularly serious. Henrietta managed them by adjusting her own behaviour. She spoke for slightly less time to men her husband had named. She showed him the letters that arrived. She came home from Devonshire House at the hour he had said he wanted her home. She was, in the language her own upbringing had given her, a dutiful wife, and she made the dutiful adjustments without resentment in the way her mother had taught her. The adjustments did not improve the situation. Duncannon's irritabilities grew. He began to make scenes in private, to raise his voice at her in their bedroom, to accuse her of attentions she had not given, to demand explanations of her movements that she had to provide several times over before he was satisfied. He did not in the first years strike her. He came close, on several occasions in 1783 and 1784, to striking her by raising his hand and not bringing it down, by gripping her wrist hard enough to leave a mark. She would then have to hide under a long sleeve at the next morning's breakfast. The household staff noticed. A maid wrote, in a letter to her own sister in service at another house, that the Viscount had a violent temper in private, and that Lady Duncannon was a saint, and the letter, which survives in a county archive, is the earliest piece of independent testimony of what was happening behind the doors of Cavendish Square. But Henrietta did not tell her mother. She did not tell Georgiana. She did not tell her brother. She told no one in the first 3 or 4 years of the marriage's deterioration, because the period did not permit a young aristocratic wife to tell anyone about such things. A bad marriage was a private matter to be borne. A wife who complained about her husband was a wife who had failed in some basic way at the work of marriage. The Countess, who would have been horrified to learn what was happening, would also have advised her daughter to bear it patiently and to pray for her husband's better nature, because that is what the religious training of the household had taught Henrietta to expect of marriage. Marriage was a duty before it was a comfort. The duty did not depend on the husband's behaviour. The duty had to be performed regardless. By 1786, when Caroline was a year old and Henrietta was 25, the situation had worsened. Duncannon was now drinking heavily in the evenings. The drinking made the temper worse. He had, on at least one occasion, that survives in the private memory of the household, struck his wife a single blow over the face, in their bedroom, after an argument about her attendance at a party at Devonshire House, and had apologised afterwards in the morning in the manner that violent husbands apologise, with tears and protestations and promises that the moment would not recur. It did recur. Henrietta, with 4 small children and no clear place to go, and a household of servants and tenants and family connections that would have made any sort of public separation a catastrophe, did what 18th century wives in her position did. She bore it. She managed him. She arranged her days so as to minimize the moments that produced his worst behavior. She made sure she was always with one of the children when he came home from his club. Because he restrained himself in the presence of a child, she found small, quiet refuges in the day. A half-hour walk in the garden of Cavendish Square in the late afternoon, an hour reading in the small upstairs sitting room she had made her own, the daily visits to her sister at Devonshire House, which were the longest sustained pleasure of her week, and which were also, increasingly, the events that caused her the most trouble when she returned home. Devonshire House was, for Henrietta in those years, both her refuge and her ordeal. The Duchess's drawing rooms at Piccadilly had become, by the mid-1780s, the central meeting place of London Whig society, and the cast of figures who came there every week had developed into the most brilliantly assembled circle of politicians, writers, wits, and aristocrats that London had produced since the heyday of the Holland House set. Charles James Fox was there constantly, often arriving at midnight from Brooks's and staying until dawn in conversation with the Duchess about the day's parliamentary business. Sheridan was there often, and read aloud from his own plays, and made the company laugh in a way no other guest could. The Prince of Wales, by then 24 and the most determined Whig in the kingdom by family allegiance, was there several evenings a week. The Duke, who had married Georgiana for the dynastic reasons aristocratic dukes married, was there sometimes and not at others, and his place in the household had increasingly been taken by Bess Foster. The matter of Bess Foster requires a brief and careful explanation, because she was the central female figure of Devonshire House in those years, and Henrietta would, in time, have her own complicated relationship with her. Lady Elizabeth Foster, known to the family and to all of London as Bess, was a young Irish-English woman of impoverished circumstances who had separated from her husband in 1782 and who had been taken up by Georgiana at Bath that summer in a friendship of immediate and intense closeness. Bess had moved into Devonshire House by the end of the year. She had stayed there. By the time Henrietta was attending the Duchess's drawing rooms in 1785, Bess was a permanent member of the household, occupying the third position in what was by then openly understood to be a domestic menage a trois. The Duke, the Duchess, and Bess, living together at Devonshire House and at the country house at Chatsworth, with the Duke and Bess having become lovers, and the Duchess having absorbed the relationship into the household structure with what visitors described as either remarkable tolerance or remarkable self-deception, depending on the visitor's view of the matter. The Duchess loved Bess. The Duke loved Bess. The Duke probably also loved the Duchess, in a quieter way, though the household's affections did not run on simple lines. Henrietta watched the Devonshire House menage form over the early 1780s. She did not entirely approve of it. She did not, by her own private letters of the period, condemn it either. She loved her sister. She accepted, slowly, the household her sister had chosen to make. She came to know Bess in the years when Bess was establishing herself as the Duchess's closest companion, and she developed her own complicated relationship with the woman. Bess was charming. Bess was beautiful. Bess was, by the testimony of everyone who knew her in those years, gifted in the particular feminine art of making other people feel they were the centre of her attention. She made Henrietta feel that way. Henrietta knew, at the level of her own intelligence, that Bess was making her feel that way, and that the same charm was being deployed on everyone else in the room, but the charm was real, and Henrietta liked Bess despite the careful watching she had to do around her, and the relationship between the three women, Duchess, sister, and menage companion, became one of the strange, permanent triangulations of Henrietta's social life over the next 20 years. The Duke himself, William Cavendish, the 5th Duke of Devonshire, was a remote figure in Henrietta's life. He was 13 years older than her. He had married her sister when Henrietta was 13. He had been a kind brother-in-law in a formal way for the years that followed, but he was not a man Henrietta had ever quite known. He was a reserved, taciturn, slightly melancholy man whose principal passions were horses, mineral collections and his dogs, and who endured the Duchess's parties at Piccadilly with the patient indifference of a man whose own preferences ran in entirely different directions. He spoke to Henrietta when they were in the same room with the formal courtesy of his position. He did not, in any sustained way, take an interest in her. She did not take it personally. The Duke was, by temperament, a man who took an interest in very few people. Even his close affection for Bess, in the years it became evident, was conducted in a low key. There is no record of the Duke ever showing anything that could be called passion for either his wife or his mistress. He was simply the man at the centre of the house who let the Duchess do what she wanted and who provided the financial framework within which the household's social life unfolded. What Henrietta got from Devonshire House in those years, beyond the simple pleasure of being near her sister, was an introduction to the wider Whig political world and to a particular set of young men who would become, in different ways, the figures of her own later life. Fox was the central such figure, although Fox would not be the man Henrietta herself loved. He was too dissolute, too much his own creature, too entirely absorbed in his political career. Sheridan was warmer, but Sheridan was married, and would in any case marry a third time after his first wife's death, and was not in the marriage market for friendship of the kind that became something more. The Prince of Wales was a near contemporary of Henrietta's, and admired her from a distance for some years. He wrote her letters of warm friendship in the late 1780s that, had Henrietta been more available, and the prince less catastrophic in his attachments, might have developed into something else. But his secret marriage to Maria Fitzherbert in December 1785 ended any possibility of a serious attachment from his side, and Henrietta had not in any case encouraged him. The man Henrietta would in time love had not yet appeared in the Devonshire House drawing rooms in the mid-1780s. Granville Levison Gower was a boy of 12 at the time of her wedding, and a youth of 17, still on the early stages of his grand tour at the time her fourth child was born. He would not enter Henrietta's life until he was 21 and she was 33, which was 8 years away from the moment the Cavendish Square marriage was beginning to deteriorate most seriously. In those years, between 1786 and 1791, Henrietta's life was the management of her difficult husband, the raising of her 4 small children, and the slow private accumulation of unhappiness that had no recognizable outlet. The first serious crisis of the marriage came in 1789, when Henrietta was 28. Duncannon's drinking had reached a level at which the violence had become more frequent, and the apologies had become less convincing. He had, in May of that year, threatened her in front of one of the children, Caroline, then 3½, and had been observed by the nursery maid in the act of raising his voice and his hand at his wife with the child present. The maid reported the incident to the senior housekeeper. The housekeeper, who had served the family for some years, and who had grown deeply attached to Henrietta, took the unprecedented step of writing privately to Countess Spencer at Spencer House to inform her, with great discretion, that her daughter's marriage was in a state of distress that warranted the family's attention. The Countess received the letter. She came to Cavendish Square the following morning, in the middle of breakfast, without any prior announcement, and asked her daughter directly what was happening in the household. Henrietta did not deny it. She told her mother in the upstairs sitting room. that the marriage had become difficult. She did not give the full extent of the difficulty in the first conversation. She would not give the full extent of the difficulty for some years. But she said enough that the Countess understood that morning that her younger daughter had been bearing a domestic situation of considerable seriousness alone for some years, and that something would have to be done about it before the situation worsened further. The Countess and Henrietta talked for 2 hours. The Countess, who could be formidable when she chose to be, then asked to see her son-in-law. Duncannon was sent for. The conversation that took place between the Countess and Duncannon in the same upstairs sitting room has not been recorded in any document that survives, but the household's later memory of it, preserved in the testimony of the housekeeper and in a later letter from one of Henrietta's brothers, was that the Countess made it clear that the Spencer family was now aware of the situation, that the Spencer family would not tolerate further escalation, and that if any harm came to her daughter, she would not hesitate to use the family's considerable political and social connections to make the matter known. Duncannon was, by all accounts, shaken. He apologized to his mother-in-law. He apologized again to his wife. He promised again that the behaviour would not recur. It did recur. The Countess's intervention brought Henrietta perhaps 18 months of relative peace, during which Duncannon controlled himself to a degree that suggested he was capable of controlling himself when he chose to. By the early summer of 1791, however, the old pattern had returned. Duncannon had begun to drink heavily again. He had begun to make scenes again. He had, on one occasion in July of that year, struck his wife badly enough to bruise her arm in a way she could not entirely hide from the family at the next gathering at Spencer House. The Countess, who saw the bruise and understood what it meant, decided that more drastic action was now required. She proposed to Henrietta that the two of them, with the smaller children, would leave the Cavendish Square household for an extended period, perhaps 6 months, perhaps a year, and travel to the continent. Henrietta's health, the Countess would say publicly, required a change of climate. The two boys, William and Frederick, would remain at school in England under the care of their father and the Spencer relatives. The two younger children, John William and Caroline, would come with their mother and grandmother. The arrangement would have the practical effect of separating Henrietta from her husband for the better part of a year without producing the sort of formal scandal a public separation would have generated. Duncannon accepted the arrangement. He had by then understood that he could not afford a public quarrel with the Spencer family. He agreed that his wife should travel for her health. He agreed that the two younger children should accompany her. He signed the financial provisions the Countess had drawn up for the journey. He did not, by the testimony of the housekeeper who witnessed the departure, come to the door to say goodbye to his wife on the morning of her leaving. He had ridden out early. The carriages departed Cavendish Square in the late morning, with Henrietta and her mother and the two younger children inside, and the small household of attendants and servants in the carriages behind. They set out for Dover. They crossed the Channel. They began the long, slow tour through France and Italy that was meant to give Henrietta the rest from her marriage that she had not had in 11 years, and that was, in the event, going to give her something else as well. The France they entered in the late summer of 1791 was not the France the Spencer family had known on its earlier diplomatic visits. The revolution had begun 2 years earlier with the storming of the Bastille in July 1789. By the late summer of 1791, when Henrietta's party crossed the Channel and made its way through Calais and Paris, and out toward the south, the country was in a condition of unstable transition that the Spencer party witnessed at intervals as they travelled. The visible nervousness of the innkeepers, the small groups of revolutionary soldiers at the city gates, the awareness in every conversation that something was about to change again, the question of how much further it would go. The Countess, who had political instincts as sharp as anyone in her circle, understood within days of landing that the situation was deteriorating faster than even London had been aware of. The party moved more quickly through France than it had originally intended. They reached Lyon by early September. They crossed into Italy by mid-October. They settled, for the first long stay of the journey, in Naples, where the British minister was a family friend and where the climate would, the Countess had been assured, be beneficial to Henrietta's health. The Naples winter of 1791 to 1792 was the worst period of Henrietta's adult life up to that point. She was 30 years old. She had separated herself, by means of an extended foreign journey, from a husband whose behaviour had brought her to the brink of physical breakdown. She was carrying, in her own body, the accumulated strain of 11 years of an unhappy marriage and 4 pregnancies, and the chronic anxiety of household management under conditions of domestic threat. She was also carrying, in her own head, the awareness that she would have to return to her marriage at the end of the journey, because there was nothing else for her to return to. The break from Cavendish Square had not been a separation. It had been a respite. The respite would end. The marriage would resume. She did not know how she was going to bear the resumption. The British community at Naples in the autumn of 1791, by the standards of any other foreign capital in Europe, an unusually intimate and unusually formed circle. The British minister at the Neapolitan court was Sir William Hamilton, then in his 61st year, a refined antiquarian and volcanologist who had been in his post since 1764, and who had, by long residence, become almost as much a figure of the Neapolitan court as of the British diplomatic service. He kept a fine house at the Palazzo Sessa, with a famous view over the bay toward Vesuvius, and he received the British travellers passing through Naples in the manner of a hospitable proconsul of a remote province. He had been a widower since 1782, and he had, in the years since his first wife's death, formed an attachment to a young Englishwoman of striking beauty and obscure origins named Emma Hart, who had come to him in 1786 as a kind of ward, sent out from London by his nephew Charles Greville, for reasons that the elder Hamilton had at first not entirely understood, and that had, in the event, produced one of the most discussed romances of the late 18th century British community abroad. Emma Hart was 26 in 1791. She was extraordinarily beautiful in the particular long-limbed way that the period responded to. She had been, before her arrival in Naples, the mistress of several English gentlemen of position. She had developed, in her years at the Palazzo Sessa, a remarkable accomplishment of her own, the so-called attitudes, a kind of one-woman performance art in which she draped herself in classical robes and posed in living tableaux representing figures from antique sculpture which had become the social entertainment of every British visitor to Naples, and which the foreign community attended in a state of mixed admiration and bemusement. Hamilton was about to marry her, in fact, in the September of that year, in a ceremony in London during a brief diplomatic leave, and the marriage would, on his return to Naples, transform Emma from the minister's mistress into the British minister's wife, and create one of the strangest social experiments of the British abroad in the period. Henrietta and her mother arrived at Naples in the company of this transition. They were received at the Palazzo Sessa within a week of their arrival in the city, in the manner the British diplomatic establishment received aristocratic travellers, and they met both Sir William and the new Lady Hamilton in the same evening. Lady Spencer, who had known Sir William slightly from his earlier London years, was relieved to find an old acquaintance in the post. She was less certain what to make of his new wife. The Countess wrote to her sister-in-law that evening that the new Lady Hamilton was a woman of unmistakable beauty and of warmth that bordered, in the Countess's careful private judgment, on the unrefined, and that the marriage was the sort of thing one would not have expected of a man of Sir William's antiquarian sensibilities, but that the British community at Naples had absorbed the elevation with the practical generosity small expatriate communities tend to bring to such situations. Henrietta, who was less conventional than her mother in these matters, and who had been observing the Devonshire House menage à trois at close quarters for nearly a decade, found Emma Hamilton fascinating. She found her warm. She found her, in the long afternoons of the Naples autumn, that the two women spent together when the Spencer party visited the Palazzo Sessa, the kindest and most unaffected female companion she had encountered since leaving England. Emma Hamilton received Henrietta with the particular openness that women of her own difficult background sometimes show to women of higher station who have arrived in their company already wounded, and Henrietta, who was wounded in ways the new Lady Hamilton recognised, without the matter being put into words, responded with the gratitude of a woman who had not been received in that open-handed way by anyone for many years. The Hamiltons gave the Spencer party perhaps 2 dinners a week through the autumn months. The dinners were attended by the small floating British community of Naples, by the more cultivated members of the Neapolitan aristocracy, who were welcomed at the Palazzo Sessa as exotic curiosities, and on one occasion by Maria Carolina herself, the Queen of Naples, who was an old friend of Sir William's, and who had developed, in the years since Emma's arrival, an unexpectedly close friendship with the new Lady Hamilton that would in time prove politically consequential. Henrietta sat at these dinners and observed. She was 30 years old, the daughter of one earl and the wife of the heir to another, the sister of the most famous Duchess in England, and she was sitting in the dining room of the British minister at Naples, watching the Queen of the Two Sicilies converse intimately with a former mistress of a London bachelor in the language of close personal friendship, and she was understanding, in the slow, accumulating way the 18th century had taught her to understand such things, that the social world she had been raised inside was a smaller and more provisional thing than her upbringing had suggested. The world was bigger than Devonshire House. The world was bigger than the Whig aristocracy. The world contained in its various courts and cities women who had risen by means her own upbringing would have considered impossible, and who had in their elevations become the close confidants of queens. She did not, in any direct sense, draw a personal lesson from these observations. She did, however, store them in the careful private archive of her own thinking, and they would shape, in ways she could not have predicted at the time, her own capacity in later years to accept the unconventional households that the people she loved would in time construct. The autumn passed. The Countess and Henrietta spent their days quietly between the Palazzo Sessa and the apartments they had taken in the British Quarter, with morning walks along the bay when the weather permitted, and afternoons of reading and writing letters when it did not. The 2 younger children, John William and Caroline, were 6 and 5 respectively, and were in the daily care of an English governess the Countess had brought with them. The children played in the garden of the apartments, and were taken occasionally to the Hamiltons for sweets, and the sort of attention English children received when they were the only such children in a foreign city. Caroline, even at 5, was the more notable of the two. She had inherited from her Aunt Georgiana the long, sharp wit and the particular quickness of speech that would in adulthood become her most charming and her most dangerous quality, and she was, in the Naples autumn, the fierce ornament of every household she entered. She had a stroke in the early weeks of January 1792. The stroke was minor. By the modern terminology, it would probably be described as a transient ischemic attack, or possibly a small embolic event affecting the left hemisphere. But it left her with weakness on the right side of her body for some weeks, and difficulty forming sentences fluently for some weeks more, and a general exhaustion that took several months to lift. She was 30 years old. The Italian physicians who attended her in Naples could not say what had caused the event, and the Countess, who nursed her daughter through the recovery with the practiced efficiency of an 18th century mother who had been through every kind of family illness, could only assume that the stress of the previous years had finally produced a physical consequence. The medical understanding of the period was not equipped to name. Henrietta recovered slowly. She did not fully recover. The minor weakness on her right side would never entirely lift. She would, for the rest of her life, have a faintly stiffened right hand that did not write as fluently as her left, and she would, for the rest of her life, sometimes lose words mid-sentence in conversation, and have to wait for them to come back to her. She had been damaged. She had been damaged at 30. By a marriage she had not been able to refuse, and by a domestic situation she had not been able to escape, and the damage would be with her for the next 30 years. The Countess and Henrietta did not return to England that spring. They could not. Henrietta was not strong enough for the journey, and the political situation in France had worsened further, and a route by sea from Italy back to England would have required arrangements the party did not have in place. They settled instead in Naples for the remainder of 1792 and the early months of 1793, with side trips to Rome and Florence as Henrietta's health permitted. The British community in Naples, which included Sir William Hamilton, the ambassador, and his then mistress and future wife Emma Hart, received them warmly. Henrietta met Emma Hart in those months, and would describe her in letters home as a beautiful and slightly alarming young woman of striking warmth, by which she meant that Emma's manners were not entirely those of an English drawing-room, and that she was, in the assessment of a Spencer daughter, a creature of a slightly different category. The friendship would not deepen, but Henrietta would, ever afterwards, remember Emma Hart with the fascination that women of her own class sometimes remembered women who had risen from positions beneath theirs by means they themselves could not have employed. The news of her father-in-law's death reached Naples in March 1793. The first Earl of Bessborough had died at Roehampton in his 79th year of an illness that had not been thought serious at the start and had progressed quickly. Duncannon, by the operation of the family succession, was now the second Earl of Bessborough. Henrietta, by the same operation, was now Lady Bessborough. The news did not entirely change her situation, but it did require her to return to England, because there were estates to manage, and a transition to oversee, and a husband who would need her presence in the new role. She and her mother and the children began the journey home in the late spring of 1793, by a route that avoided revolutionary France entirely, going overland to Genoa, and then by sea through Gibraltar and home. They arrived back in England in July 1793, after an absence of nearly 2 years. The marriage Henrietta returned to was not entirely the marriage she had left. Duncannon now Bessborough had, in his wife's 2-year absence, lost his father, inherited his title, and assumed the responsibilities of an Irish earldom. He had also, by the report of those who had been in his company during her absence, done a considerable amount of private reflection. He had not abandoned his drinking, but he had moderated it. He had not abandoned his temper, but he had begun to manage it. He received his wife and his mother-in-law at Roehampton with what witnesses described as genuine emotion. He had missed his wife. He had been frightened by the report of his physician, by the news of her illness in Naples. He resolved, for what the Countess privately considered the third or fourth time, to be a better husband. The marriage, in the summer of 1793, entered a calmer period than it had been in for some years. The calmer period would last for the rest of the marriage in a structural sense. The Bessboroughs would continue to be married, in name and in fact, for another 28 years. They would have one further child together, a daughter who would be born and die in infancy in 1796, and whose loss would mark them both. They would manage the family estates jointly, with Henrietta increasingly taking the lead in the practical work of estate management, because her husband was not, in temperament, suited to it. They would share a roof. They would share, after a fashion, a life. But the deep affection of the early months of the marriage had been broken in the difficult years of the 1780s and would not be repaired, and the calmer period after 1793 was a calmer period precisely because Henrietta had ceased to expect from her husband the things she had once expected. She had stopped, in any meaningful sense, hoping that Bessborough would become the husband she had once thought she had married. She had, in the long Naples winter, made her peace with the fact that her marriage was not going to give her what marriage was supposed to give. She was 32. She had 4 children. She had a partially weakened right hand and a tendency to lose words mid-sentence. She had a husband she could now manage rather than fear. She had no expectation, in the summer of 1793, that her life was about to change in any further significant way. She was wrong about that. She had not yet met Granville. He was 21 years old, in the summer of 1793, recently returned from his grand tour, and about to be introduced into the Devonshire house circle by his elder half-brother. Henrietta would meet him in the autumn. The meeting would alter the rest of her life. Granville Leveson Gower was the second son of the first Marquess of Stafford by his third wife, Susanna Stuart, and he had been born in October 1773 at the family seat at Trentham in Staffordshire. He was therefore 12 years younger than Henrietta, which was an age gap that the 18th century social world considered significant in either direction, and which would, when the relationship between them eventually developed, never be fully absorbed into the casual conversation of the people around them. He was the sort of younger son who had been raised in the comfortable assumption of an ample income and a chosen career. A younger son of a marquess in a wealthy political family did not, in the 1780s and 1790s, need to make his own fortune, and Granville had been educated accordingly at Westminster School and at Christ Church, Oxford, with the expectation that he would enter Parliament under his family's patronage and pursue the gentleman's career of a diplomat or a politician. He had taken his BA from Christ Church in 1791 at 17. He had then gone on his grand tour, in the company of a tutor, through France in the early stages of the Revolution, and on into Italy and Germany. He had spent the better part of 2 years abroad. He had returned to England in the spring of 1793, just before Henrietta and her mother began their own return from Naples, and he had spent the summer at Trentham and then at his family's London house, easing himself back into English society after the long absence. He was tall, fair-haired, well-built, and possessed of the sort of face that the period considered handsome in the cleanly drawn, slightly serious manner that was then in fashion. He was also, by every account that survives of him in those years, considerably more intelligent than the average younger son of a marquess. He had read widely. He had absorbed the political education that his family connections had made available to him. He spoke French and Italian fluently. He had, by the standards of the day, the makings of an excellent diplomat, which is in fact what he would become. He would later serve as British ambassador to Russia twice and to France, and would be one of the more accomplished British diplomats of the Napoleonic and Restoration period. None of that was yet apparent in 1793. What was apparent to the people who met him on his return from the continent was that he was an unusually serious and unusually attractive young man, whose company was pleasant and whose conversation was rewarding. He was introduced to Henrietta in the late autumn of 1793 in the drawing-room at Devonshire House by his half-brother George Granville Leveson Gower, who was a member of the Whig circle and a regular at the Duchess's parties. The introduction was made in the company of perhaps a dozen other guests, and it was in its surface form entirely unremarkable. The young man bowed. Lady Bessborough offered her hand. They exchanged the pleasantries the period required. Granville said something about his recent travels in Italy. Henrietta, who had so recently returned from Naples, asked him a question about the route he had taken. He answered. The conversation extended for perhaps a quarter of an hour in the small alcove off the principal drawing-room where Henrietta liked to sit during her sister's larger parties. And at the end of the quarter hour, the young man had been called away by another guest, and Henrietta had returned her attention to the friend she had been speaking with before the introduction. She did not, at the time of that first meeting, think anything in particular about him. She would later say, in a letter to him written some years afterwards, that she had thought him agreeable and pleasant and slightly grave for a man of his age, and that she had not, on the strength of 1/4 hour's conversation, formed any further impression. He was a young man of the kind who passed through Devonshire House by the dozen, and Henrietta, at 32, had enough experience of the drawing-rooms of Piccadilly to know that the young men of the Whig circle were almost all charming in the same general way, and that the charm was not, in itself, sufficient ground for taking any of them especially seriously. She forgot him within a week. He, however, did not forget her. By his own subsequent admission in letters that he wrote to her decades later in their lifelong correspondence, he had been struck that first afternoon in the alcove at Devonshire House by something in her manner that he had not been able to name at the time, and had spent some years trying to articulate. She was older than he was considerably. She had a slightly stiffened right hand that she kept folded under her left in her lap. She had a soft, slightly hesitant manner of speaking, which Granville eventually understood was the after-effect of the Naples stroke, but which at the time he had taken to be a quality of her personal manner, a kind of attentive thoughtfulness that left small pauses in her sentences. She was, by his account, the most thoughtful conversational presence he had encountered in the months since his return to England. He had wanted, when he was called away, to come back to her. He had not been able to that evening, because the social pattern of the Duchess's drawing-rooms did not allow it, but he had, on returning home that night, made a private note in the small journal he had begun to keep on his grand tour, recording the names of the guests at Devonshire House that evening. The note for Henrietta read, in his own hand, Lady Bessborough, sister of the Duchess, admirable. He was 20. She was 32. He pursued her by the slow methods available to a young man of his class and period. He requested invitations to the same parties she would be attending. He arranged to be presented to her again in the company of his half-brother. He engineered, over the spring of 1794, perhaps half a dozen further conversations of the same quarter-hour duration in various of the Whig drawing-rooms of London. He wrote her, in May of 1794, his first letter, a formal note acknowledging her kindness in having spoken with him at a recent party, with postscript asking whether she had finished the book she had mentioned in conversation, and whether she would consider lending it to him when she had. The book was a recent French translation of an Italian travel memoir, and Henrietta, by then beginning to be aware that something was forming itself in the young man's attention, sent it to him with a brief reply. The correspondence began in that small way and grew. Over the summer of 1794 they exchanged letters at intervals of 2 or 3 weeks. The letters were, in form, the polite cultivated exchanges of two people with shared literary and political interests. They discussed books. They discussed the news from the continent, where the Revolutionary War was beginning to spread. They discussed mutual acquaintances. The letters were not in their content anything that would have caused difficulty if Bessborough had opened them, which he probably did, in the manner of a husband of his character. There was nothing in them for him to object to. There was, however, in the steady rhythm of the correspondence itself, the slow establishment of a relationship that did not, by 1794, have a formal name, and that was beginning to occupy more of Henrietta's interior life than she had at first realized. She did not, in the first year, think of Granville in any way that her religious upbringing would have called dangerous. She thought of him as a young friend. She thought of him as a younger man whose intelligence she enjoyed and whose company she preferred to the company of most of her own contemporaries. She was 33 by the autumn of 1794. He was 21. The friendship in her own private accounting was a friendship of the kind a married woman of her age could properly have with a younger man, provided that the friendship was conducted within the limits the period had laid down for such things. Limits, in the 1790s, meant the careful avoidance of any private meeting that could not be explained, the careful avoidance of any letter that could not be read aloud in mixed company, the careful avoidance of any expression of affection that exceeded what the friendship between two intelligent people of different sexes was permitted to contain. Henrietta observed the limits in 1794 and in 1795 and for several years afterwards. She did not write Granville any letter that would have embarrassed her if it had been opened. She did not meet him in private. She did not, in any explicit way, encourage him to consider their relationship as more than a friendship. But the friendship deepened nonetheless. Granville came to Roehampton in the summer of 1795 in the company of his half-brother to stay for a week as part of a larger house party. He was there with the formal sanction of the host, who was Bessborough. He was a young man visiting a senior Whig family in the manner of younger men in their position. He spent his days in conversation with his hostess in the gardens of Roehampton, in the company of the children, of the other guests, and of the dogs, with all the propriety the period required. He spent his evenings in the drawing-room reading aloud from books Henrietta had recommended to him. He did not, in those days at Roehampton, declare any feeling toward her that could not have been declared in the hearing of her husband. But the household staff at Roehampton noticed, in the way household staff notice such things, that Lady Bessborough's manner around the young man had a quality her manner around other young guests did not have, and the household staff began, very quietly among themselves, to remark on it. The summer of 1795 was the turning point. The deeper turning came in the autumn of that year, when Granville wrote Henrietta a letter from Trentham that crossed the line their previous correspondence had observed. The letter was not explicit. The letter did not, even in its more dangerous passages, contain any direct declaration of love, but it contained a paragraph in which Granville described to Henrietta the loneliness of his country house, the absence in his daily life of any company he valued, and the particular quality of conversation that he had found in her drawing rooms and could not find elsewhere. He concluded the paragraph with a sentence that said simply, "I think of our talks more than I ought to, and the words on the page have a value to me that I will not try to describe further." Henrietta received the letter at Cavendish Square in the 3rd week of October. She read it once. She placed it in the small drawer of her writing desk where she kept private correspondence. She sat for some time at the desk afterwards, not writing anything, simply sitting with her hands folded in her lap. She knew by the time she rose from the desk, perhaps half an hour later, that the relationship had altered. She knew that the next letter she wrote in reply would have to either correct the deviation in Granville's last paragraph and return the correspondence to its previous limits, or it would have to acknowledge what he had said and permit the relationship to develop in the direction his letter had pointed. She knew, in the same half hour of sitting at the desk, that she did not want to write the corrective letter. She wanted, in the inward moral accounting that her religious upbringing had taught her to keep with herself, the second letter. She wanted to permit the relationship to develop. She wrote the second letter that evening. The letter has not survived in any of the public collections, but its general substance is clear from the response Granville sent within 10 days, and from the letters that followed. She had not, in her response, declared any love. She had, in careful style of an intelligent woman of 34, who had thought about her response for some hours, indicated to him that his last paragraph had not displeased her, that she valued the correspondence between them, and that she hoped it would continue. She had not, in any explicit way, opened the door. She had, however, declined to close it. Granville, who was a young man of considerable sensitivity to such matters, understood what she had done. The next letter from him was warmer. The next letter from her was warmer in return. By the spring of 1796, the correspondence had become, in everything but the formal acknowledgment of its nature, the correspondence of two people who had begun to be in love with each other. The full acknowledgment, in any formal sense, came in the summer of 1796. The exact date is not certain. The exact circumstances are not known. What is known is that by the autumn of that year, by the testimony of letters that have survived, Henrietta and Granville had become lovers in the full physical sense as well as the emotional one. They had become so with the discretion, the period required, and with the practical arrangements such relationships demanded. Meetings at the country houses of mutual friends, letters carried by trusted servants, the careful management of public appearances, so that no observer would have grounds to suspect what was already taking place in private. The relationship was now, in the language of the period, an affair. It was the central romance of Henrietta's life. It would last, in various phases of intensity, for the next 25 years. She did not stop loving her husband in the qualified sense she had previously loved him, but the love had become a different thing, a kind of practical fondness mixed with the older fear of his moods, the long companionship of a difficult marriage that had not been able to be otherwise. What she gave to Granville in the next 2 decades was the part of herself that her marriage had never been able to receive. The intellectual companionship, the serious conversation about books and politics and the conduct of life, the deep mutual attention that her own religious training had taught her was the proper foundation of a marriage, and that her own marriage had never been able to provide. She gave him these things in letters of considerable length and considerable beauty, the bulk of which survive in the Granville Papers, and which are among the most remarkable documents of an aristocratic love affair to have come down from the period. She also, in time, gave him 2 children. The first child, a daughter, was conceived in the late autumn of 1799 at the country house of a mutual friend. Henrietta was 38 years old. She had not been pregnant in 14 years. She had thought herself, by her own private reckoning, past the years of childbearing, and the pregnancy was a shock to both of them. She did not tell her husband. She could not tell her husband. The dates would not have worked, even had she been willing to attempt the deception. Bessborough had been at his Irish estates for the relevant months, and Henrietta had been at Roehampton, and the marital bed had not, in those years, been a place either of them frequented. She told Granville. She told her mother. She told, eventually, her sister. She told no one else. The Countess, who by then had been a widow for some years, and who lived with her daughter in a state of close practical alliance that the difficulties of the marriage had created, took charge of the management of the situation with the formidable practicality she brought to family crises. The plan was constructed over the spring and early summer of 1800. Henrietta would withdraw from London by the late spring, on the public grounds that her health required country quiet, and would retire to a small house on the south coast, where her mother and a small trusted staff would attend her through the confinement. The child, when born, would be transferred immediately to the care of a discreet family in the country, paid by Granville and Lady Spencer, who would raise the child as their own ward. The child would be acknowledged in private by both parents. The child would never be acknowledged publicly. Bessborough would not be informed. The Spencer family connections that had been mobilized in 1789 to manage Henrietta's marital difficulties were now mobilized again, in the same quiet way, to manage the larger difficulty of an illegitimate child in an unhappy aristocratic marriage. The daughter was born on the 24th of August, 1800, at a small house near Salisbury, attended by an elderly midwife who had been Lady Spencer's servant for many years, and who could be trusted absolutely. The child was a healthy girl. She was named Henrietta, in a quiet tribute to her mother's own diminutive, and she was given the surname Stuart, which was Granville's own mother's maiden name, and which would identify the child loosely as part of the Granville-Leveson-Gower family connection without acknowledging her paternity directly. She was placed, within a week of her birth, in the household of a clergyman and his wife in Hertfordshire, who had been chosen with care for their discretion and their warmth, and who would raise her with their own children. Henrietta saw her infant daughter twice, briefly, in the first month of her life. Henrietta then returned to London, by easy stages, in the early autumn, and resumed her position in her husband's household at Cavendish Square, as though nothing had occurred. Bessborough, who had been at his Irish estates throughout the relevant months, returned to London in October, and noticed nothing. The second child, a son, was conceived in the summer of 1801 at the same country house at which the first child had been conceived. Henrietta was 39 years old. The pregnancy was again a shock, although this time less of one, because she had now begun to understand that her body, in the late 30s, was not behaving with the regularity of earlier years. The plan was constructed again. The withdrawal from London was managed again, this time on the grounds of a family bereavement that gave her cover. The boy was born on the 2nd of April 1802 in the same small house near Salisbury, attended by the same midwife. He was named George in tribute to Granville's elder brother, and given the same Stuart surname his sister had been given. He was placed in the same Hertfordshire household. Henrietta, by then 19 months old, became, in the practical arrangement of the clergyman's family, the elder sister of a younger brother who was in fact her full brother by blood. Henrietta saw the two children, in the years that followed, at intervals of perhaps 6 months. She would travel to Hertfordshire in the carriage with one trusted attendant, on the pretext of visiting a friend in the county, and would spend perhaps 2 or 3 days at the clergyman's house, and would spend those days in the company of her children, and would then return to London and resume her position in her husband's household. She could not bring them to London. She could not even, with full safety, write to them directly. Her letters to the clergyman's family were addressed to the clergyman's wife, and were phrased in the manner of letters from a distant cousin, inquiring after the children of a mutual friend. She watched them grow up, in the limited way she was able to watch them, with the quiet inward heartbreak of a mother who could not properly mother her own children. Granville visited them more often than she did, because he was a single man, and his movements were less observed. He paid for their education. He paid for their clothes. He paid for the dowry that would eventually be necessary when Henrietta married. He took, in the practical sense, the role of a father, although he could not, even in private with the children themselves, ever fully acknowledge what he was. The children grew up believing themselves to be the wards of the clergyman's family. They came to understand, slowly and partially as they grew older, that there was something unusual about their position. They came to know Granville as a regular visitor. They came to know Henrietta less well, because her visits were rarer. They would not, in their adolescent and adult years, be told the full truth of their parentage until after Henrietta's death, when Granville, by then a married man with a separate legitimate family, would take the unusual step of informing them and supporting them openly in the manner he had been unable to support them while their mother was alive. The two hidden children were, for Henrietta, the deepest private grief of her middle life. She had 4 legitimate children whom she had raised in her own house, and whom she could be a mother to in the open sense. She had 2 children whom she could not. The asymmetry tormented her in the unguarded hours of her days, in a manner she did not entirely share even with Granville. She wrote in her journal, in 1804, a passage that survives. "I think of them every morning. I have not seen Henrietta since March. She will be 4 in August. I shall not be there." The journal is among the few documents in which she permitted herself to express the unfiltered version of what the affair had cost her, alongside what it had given her, and the unfiltered version included the constant ongoing loss of being unable to mother the children she had borne. The affair itself continued through these years with the same regular pattern that had been established by 1796. Granville was, increasingly, an absent presence in her life. He had entered the diplomatic service in 1799, and from 1804 onward, he would spend long periods abroad on official missions, first to St. Petersburg and then to Vienna, and then back to St. Petersburg again, with brief returns to London in the gaps. Henrietta wrote to him weekly during these absences. He wrote to her with the same regularity. The letters from his St. Petersburg years are particularly long and particularly affectionate, written from the strange isolation of the Russian court, and they contain the most extended record of his side of the relationship that survives in her London life across these same years. Henrietta continued to attend Devonshire House. The Duchess's parties continued. The Whig political world continued in its long opposition to the Pitt and Addington ministries and to the war with revolutionary France that had broken out in 1793, and that would continue, with one short interruption, for the next 22 years. The Devonshire house set was, by the early years of the new century, beginning to age. Fox was in his middle 50s, still brilliant but visibly tired. Sheridan was struggling with debt and drink. The Prince of Wales had married, disastrously, his cousin Caroline of Brunswick in 1795, and his subsequent estrangement from her was the public scandal of the late 1790s. The Duke and Duchess and Bess were still together at Devonshire House and at Chatsworth, in the same triangular arrangement that had now lasted nearly 20 years. The household had absorbed several of the Duchess's debts in the late 1780s and early 1790s in great parliamentary scandals that had nearly broken the family financially, and the Duchess herself was, by 1800, a tired and visibly aged woman of 43 who had borne 3 children and conducted a public life of relentless attention, and who was beginning, by her sister's account in private letters, to show the strain of 2 decades of being the most observed woman in England. Henrietta watched her sister age. She watched the Duchess's beauty leave her, the slow erosion of the fine bone structure that had made Georgiana the most painted woman of her generation, the appearance of the small persistent illnesses of middle age, the growing weariness of the public performances. She watched her sister's eldest daughter, Lady Georgiana Cavendish, known in the family as Little G, grow into a thoughtful young woman with a quiet intelligence that her mother had not had, and that her Aunt Henrietta recognized, with a complicated kind of pride, as resembling her own. She watched the second daughter, Lady Harriet Cavendish, known as Harry O, grow up into a more difficult and more brilliant young woman, with a sharp tongue and a quick temper, and a particular fondness for her Aunt Henrietta, that the aunt returned with a particular fondness of her own. Harry O, the 8-year-old niece of 1793, and the 11-year-old of 1796, and the 17-year-old of 1802, was, in those years, simply one of the bright children of the Devonshire House household, whom her aunt loved and visited and corresponded with. Harry O would, in time, become the woman who married Granville Leveson Gower. None of the parties involved in 1802 or 1803 or 1804 had any clear suspicion that this was the direction in which the household was moving. The years between 1800 and 1806 were, in the broad shape of Henrietta's life, the most balanced she had known since her marriage. She had her 2 legitimate younger children at home. Caroline was a teenager now. John William was approaching his majority, and her 2 elder sons were at Harrow and on the cusp of their own adult lives. She had her 2 hidden children, whom she saw rarely but loved fiercely. She had Granville, who was abroad more than at home, but who was the steady centre of her interior life nonetheless. She had her sister, whom she saw nearly every week when both were in London. She had her mother, who lived in close practical alliance with her at all times. She had her marriage, which had settled into the calmer pattern of the post-1793 years, and which did not, by the early years of the new century, give her the sort of daily anxiety it had given her in the 1780s. She had her health, which was better than it had been at 30, but never entirely good, and never entirely free of the after-effects of the Naples stroke. She was, by all the testimony of her letters of the period, a woman who had reached a kind of difficult equilibrium with the life she had been given. The equilibrium broke in March 1806 with her sister's death. The Duchess had been ill for some weeks with what the physicians had called an abscess on the liver, although the modern reading of her symptoms suggests it was probably an acute liver inflammation arising from years of accumulated damage. She had taken to her bed at Devonshire House in early March. The illness had progressed quickly. By the middle of the month it had become clear that she would not recover. Henrietta was sent for. She came at once. She remained at Devonshire House for the final 3 days of her sister's life, sleeping in a small adjoining room and sitting by the bedside in the long quiet hours, while the Duke and Bess and the 3 Cavendish children also kept their vigils in the room. Georgiana died on the 30th of March 1806 at 3 in the morning, with Henrietta holding her left hand and Bess Foster holding her right, and the Duke standing at the foot of the bed in a silence none of the other watchers could break. She was 48 years old. She had been the most famous woman in England for 32 years. She had been her sister's closest companion for 44. Henrietta did not weep in the room. She wept later, in the carriage on her way home to Cavendish Square at 5 in the morning, and she wept that day in her own small upstairs sitting room, and she wept for some weeks intermittently in the manner of people who have lost the central figure of their interior life. She also, by the report of those around her, conducted herself in public with the formal composure her position required. She received the condolences of the family connections. She attended the funeral at Derby Cathedral. She wrote the letters of thanks for the formal tributes that arrived from over the country. She did, in other words, the sort of public widowing that a younger sister has to do when the elder sister, who has been the centre of the family's public life, dies suddenly at 48, and she did it with the calm, reliable competence that had been her hallmark for 30 years. What she did not do, and what survived in no document that she ever made public, was acknowledge the full shape of what the loss had done to her interior life. Georgiana had been for Henrietta the orienting fact of every year of her existence since the nursery at Wimbledon Park. The 2 sisters had been raised together. They had been launched into society together. They had married a year apart. They had borne their children at roughly parallel intervals. They had moved through the Whig social world as a pair, with Georgiana the central figure, and Henrietta the central figure's sister and confidant. The death of the elder sister did not just remove a beloved companion from Henrietta's life. The death removed the structure within which Henrietta had understood her own position for 44 years. She had been Georgiana's sister. She was, after the 30th of March, 1806, no longer anyone's sister in the same sense, because the relationship she had been the sister within had ended. She was, at 44, suddenly and unexpectedly, the senior surviving woman of her generation in the family. She had not been prepared for the role. She had not known the role was coming. She would now have to find a way to be the family elder, which had not been her position, and to do so without the elder sister, to whose presence she had referenced her own conduct for her entire life. The Cavendish children took it hardest. Little G, by then 22 and married, was inconsolable for some months. Harry O, 20 and unmarried, was more controlled in public, but by the report of her Aunt Henrietta, who knew her best, devastated in private. The youngest child, Hartington William George Cavendish, the future 6th Duke of Devonshire, was 16 and at Harrow when his mother died, and he carried the loss in the particular quiet way of an adolescent boy whose mother has died at the age when an adolescent boy most needs her. The Duke was unreadable, as he had always been. Bess Foster wept openly and continuously for weeks. The household at Devonshire House would, within 3 years, contain a new mistress. The Duke would marry Bess in 1809, after a discreet interval, and with the approval of the Cavendish children. But in the immediate aftermath of Georgiana's death, the household was simply, for the first time in nearly 30 years, a household without its central animating figure. Henrietta became, in the months that followed, the practical centre of the extended family. She took on the management of the Devonshire children's social arrangements. She acted as a kind of substitute mother to Harry O in particular, who was at exactly the age when a young woman of the period most needs maternal guidance, and who had now lost her own mother. She had her niece often at Cavendish Square. She included her in her own social engagements. She wrote her long, affectionate letters when they were apart. The bond between aunt and niece became, in 1806 and 1807, the close confidential bond it had always had the potential to be, and Harry O came to rely on her Aunt Henrietta as the closest female companion in her life. Henrietta, for her own part, gave to Harry O some of the maternal warmth she had not been able to give to her own daughter Caroline, who at 20 was already showing the volatility that would in time consume her, and who did not want her mother's guidance in the way that Harry O did. Henrietta did not, at the time, think anything of the closeness with her niece. The closeness was the natural consequence of her sister's death, and of the particular orphaning that Georgiana's death had imposed on her daughters. She did not, in 1806 or 1807 or 1808, foresee what the closeness would in time produce. She did not foresee that Granville, who had been her own lover for over a decade, and who would in time need to take a wife for the legitimate succession of his own family line, would find his eye drawn to Harry O when he met her at Cavendish Square in the autumn of 1808, and that the meeting would in time produce the offer of marriage Granville would make to Harry O in the autumn of 1809, and that the marriage that resulted would force Henrietta to give up her lover at 48 to her own 23-year-old niece. None of this was visible in 1806. The figures of the catastrophe were assembling themselves on the board, but the board itself had not yet revealed the configuration. Henrietta lived through 1806 and 1807 and 1808 in the ordinary grief of a sister who had lost her sister, and the catastrophic year was 1809, and 1809 was still some way off. Caroline Ponsonby had grown, by 1805, into the most unmanageable of Henrietta's 4 legitimate children. She was 20 years old. She was small, slender, fair-haired, with a sort of fine bone structure, and large dark eyes that the period considered ethereally beautiful, and that the Ponsonby family had been remarking on since she was 3. She was also, by every contemporary account, brilliant in the particular way that some children are brilliant in conditions of inadequate parental supervision, quick, voluble, given to extravagant enthusiasms, capable of writing accomplished verse in the manner of a sentimental novel, but incapable of sitting still through a single dinner, given to crying fits and laughing fits in equally rapid succession, and inclined by her late adolescence to small theatrical performances of feeling that her mother and grandmother had been trying for some years to discourage without effect. The household at Cavendish Square had not, by any standard of the period, been the household best calibrated to manage a child of Caroline's temperament. Henrietta had borne her at the height of the marital difficulties in 1785, had been preoccupied with the management of her difficult husband during Caroline's first 6 years, had been absent for the better part of 2 years in Italy, when Caroline was 6 and 7, and had returned in 1793 to a child who had developed, in her absence, the small, fierce independence of children whose parents have not been able to attend to them. Henrietta loved her daughter. Henrietta could not in any sustained way manage her daughter. The Countess had tried, when Caroline was in her early teens, to take over the more practical aspects of the girl's upbringing, but the Countess was by then in her 70s and had her own aging to attend to, and Caroline had not, by 1798 or 1799, been the kind of child who could be managed by a grandmother in declining health. By the time she was 15, Caroline had been roughly the child everyone in the family had described her as being for the previous decade: quick, charming, hard to govern, and given to private storms that her parents and brothers did not entirely understand the origin of. Her courtship by William Lamb began in 1803, when Caroline was 17. He was 24, a grave young Whig of considerable intelligence and unprepossessing appearance, the second son of Lord and Lady Melbourne, recently elected to Parliament in the family interest. He was by temperament the opposite of his fiancée, measured, slightly cynical, given to long silences, with a careful detachment from his own emotions that would in time make him one of the most observant prime ministers of the 19th century, but that did not, in 1803, make him an obvious match for a girl of Caroline's volatility. He fell in love with her at a party at Devonshire House in the autumn of that year. He proposed to her in the spring of 1804. Caroline accepted, with the impulsive enthusiasm she brought to most decisions, and the engagement was announced shortly afterwards. Henrietta was, in her private accounting, uncertain about the match from the start. She liked William Lamb. She thought him intelligent and steady. She also thought he had no clear understanding of the temperament he was proposing to marry. She had tried, in a private conversation with her future son-in-law in the summer of 1804, to give him some indication of the difficulties Caroline's nature might present in marriage, and he had heard her out and had said, with the patient certainty of a young man in love, that he believed his own steadiness would be a benefit to Caroline, and that he had no fears for the success of the marriage. Henrietta had not pressed the point. She had not, by the standards of her own training, the right to discourage her daughter's marriage to a respectable young man of good family on the grounds of her own private misgivings, and she had therefore given her formal consent and had set about the practical preparations. The marriage was delayed by political and financial complications until June 1805, when Caroline was 19. The wedding took place at Brocket Hall in Hertfordshire, the Melbourne family seat, in a private ceremony attended by the immediate families. Henrietta was present. The Countess was present. The Besboroughs gave the bride a substantial settlement. The Lambs gave the couple Melbourne House in London as their married residence. Caroline left her parents' household and moved into the new establishment with what witnesses described as her usual mixture of high spirits and unsettled. She was 19 years old. She was now Lady Caroline Lamb. She would, in 7 years, become the most famous and most ridiculed woman in England, in a manner that would do permanent damage to her own life and to her mother's, and that would change the public perception of the Spencer Ponsonby family for the rest of the century. The early years of the Lamb marriage were not entirely catastrophic. Caroline bore William Lamb a son in 1807, a child named George Augustus Frederick Lamb, who would, the family hoped, be a steadying influence on his mother. The boy was healthy in his first months. He developed, by the age of 2, what the period called convulsions, and what modern medicine would probably identify as some form of severe epilepsy. He never developed normally afterwards. He would live in the company of his parents and a series of devoted nurses until 1836, never speaking more than a few words, never walking with full coordination, requiring constant care. The child was the great quiet sorrow of the Lamb marriage. Caroline, by the testimony of her own letters, loved the boy with a fierce protective affection that did not waver over the rest of her life. The disability was not, however, the source of stability the family had been hoping for. Caroline's volatility, if anything, deepened in the years after the child's diagnosis became clear. She had wanted to be a wife and a mother. She had a husband who increasingly retreated into his own intellectual interests, and a child who could not respond to her in the ways she, by 1810, had begun to come apart. William and Caroline lived in the same house but conducted increasingly separate lives. William spent his days at Parliament and his evenings at his club. Caroline spent her days at home with the child, with intervals of writing and of social visits, and her evenings in increasingly erratic engagements that her husband neither encouraged nor forbade. She had, by then, begun the small habits of public extravagance that would become the central material of her later notoriety, dressing as a page boy at masquerade balls, riding astride in Hyde Park in the company of unmarried young men, holding theatrical parties at Melbourne House that scandalized the older generation. Henrietta watched her daughter with growing anxiety from Cavendish Square. She wrote to William Lamb in 1810 in a long, careful letter, suggesting that more attention to his wife's emotional state might benefit both of them. William replied politely. He did not change his behaviour. He had, by then, developed the patient withdrawal from his wife's storms that would in time make him the most discreet politician of his generation, but that, in the meantime, was leaving Caroline to manage her storms alone. The matter of Granville and Harriot developed in parallel with these difficulties, and emerged into public consequence in the autumn of 1809. Granville had returned from his second St. Petersburg embassy in the summer of that year. He was 36 years old. He had been, for 13 years, Henrietta's lover, and the relationship had been the central emotional fact of his adult life. But he had also begun, in his middle 30s, to confront the practical question of his own family succession. His elder half-brother George had a legitimate heir. The family title would not pass to Granville, but Granville's own line, in the dynastic sense the period took seriously, required legitimate children, and the 2 children he had fathered with Henrietta could not, by the terms of their parents' positions, be acknowledged or made his heirs. He needed a legitimate wife. He had needed one for several years. He had not yet found one because he had been in St. Petersburg, and because he had been, throughout his 30s, more deeply involved with Henrietta than with any other woman. He met Harriot Lady Harriet Cavendish, Henrietta's 23-year-old niece, the second daughter of the late Duchess of Devonshire, in the autumn of 1808, at Cavendish Square, in the company of her aunt. He had known her, in the casual way of family connections, since she was a small child. He saw her now as an adult for the first time. She was, at 23, a tall, thin young woman with the long Cavendish face and an unusually sharp tongue and an unmistakable intelligence. She was unmarried. She had refused by then 3 previous offers from suitors her family had thought suitable. She was the kind of young woman whom an older, intelligent man, used to the most accomplished female company of the Whig circle, might be expected to notice in a way that the younger debutantes of the year did not. Granville noticed. He did not, in the autumn of 1808, give any indication to Henrietta that the noticing had occurred. He continued the affair with Henrietta in its usual pattern. He visited Cavendish Square. He wrote his weekly letters. He attended the parties at which Henrietta was present. He also, however, began to attend the parties at which Harry-O was present, and to engineer the kind of casual encounters with her that he had engineered with Henrietta 15 years earlier in the Devonshire House drawing rooms. Harry-O, who had not been in love with anyone before, was responsive in the slow, careful way of a young woman who has been carefully educated not to commit her feelings too quickly. By the summer of 1809, the pattern of their meetings had become noticed by the Cavendish family. The Duke, who had married Bess Foster in October of the previous year, mentioned the matter to Bess, who mentioned it to Henrietta. Henrietta, who had not until that moment understood what was happening, understood it within the hour of being told. She did not, at first, believe it. She thought there must be some other explanation. She thought, in the solitary hour she sat alone in her sitting-room after Bess had left, that Granville could not possibly be in the early stages of courting her niece, because Granville was her lover, and the man who was her lover did not, in any reasonable expectation, court a young woman of her own family. She thought more darkly that if it were true, it would be the kind of betrayal that the 18th century moral imagination considered worst. The lover who takes his mistress's niece as his wife, in the very household where the mistress has presented him for over a decade. She thought, finally, that she could not bear to think about it further until she had spoken with Granville himself. She wrote to him that evening. She asked him to come to Cavendish Square the following afternoon. The conversation between Henrietta and Granville in the small upstairs sitting-room at Cavendish Square on the 4th of August 1809 was the most consequential conversation of Henrietta's adult life. It was not recorded by either party in any detail in the surviving correspondence, although both made oblique references to it in the years afterwards, and a partial reconstruction is possible from those references. Granville told her, in the language of a man who had been preparing for the conversation for some weeks, that he had been in correspondence with Harry-O for some months, that the correspondence had developed into a serious attachment on both sides, that he intended, with the Cavendish family's permission, to propose to her in the autumn, and that he had not been able to tell Henrietta sooner because he had not himself been certain, until recently, of his own intentions. He told her also in the same conversation that he loved her, that he had loved her for 13 years, and that he would continue to love her for the rest of his life regardless of what marriage he made, and that he hoped she would not, by the marriage to Harry-O, lose him as the central correspondent of her interior life. He told her that the marriage was not a betrayal but a practical necessity for his own family line, and that he had chosen Harry-O specifically because Harry-O was the niece of the woman he loved and would, he believed, understand the particular structural complexity that any future wife of his would have to absorb. Henrietta heard him out. She did not, by Granville's later account, weep during the conversation. She did not raise her voice. She asked him several careful questions. She asked him whether Harry-O knew about the past relationship. He said no. She asked him whether he intended to tell Harry-O before the marriage. He said yes with her permission. She asked him whether he intended to tell their two illegitimate children. He said yes, eventually, when they were old enough. She asked him finally whether he was certain that this was what he wanted to do, and whether he understood what it would do to her. He said yes to the first. He said yes also with hesitation to the second. She took her time in replying. She told him, eventually, that she did not feel she had the right to refuse her own niece a marriage that the niece was choosing freely. She told him she would not stand in the way. She told him she would, if it were what Harry-O wanted, support the match. She told him she did not, in the moment of the conversation, know how she was going to bear it, but that she would, in time, bear it, because she had borne worse and would have to bear this. She told him she wanted some weeks alone before he proceeded further in order to compose herself, and that she wanted, before the marriage was formally announced, to meet privately with Harry-O and to give her niece the truth about the past relationship herself, in her own words, rather than have her hear it from Granville or from anyone else. She told him these things in the small, careful voice that her stroke had left her with on the days she was most tired, and Granville, who knew the voice and what it meant, heard her out and agreed to her terms and left the house. She wept after he left. She wept by the testimony of the housekeeper who came to her sitting room with tea in the evening and found her there with her face in her hands for the better part of 3 hours. She did not speak of the matter that evening to her husband or to her remaining son at home. She slept poorly. She rose early the next morning and wrote a letter to her niece, asking her to come to Cavendish Square at her convenience for a private conversation of some importance. The conversation between Henrietta and Harry-O took place a week later, on the 11th of August, 1809, in the same small upstairs sitting room. Harry-O came in the late morning. She had been expecting, on her aunt's careful summons, something of family business, perhaps a matter relating to her late mother's estate, perhaps a question about a forthcoming social event. She had not, by her own subsequent account in her diary, anticipated what she actually heard. Henrietta told her niece, in the slow, careful way that the stroke had left her with, that Granville Levison Gower had been her own lover for 13 years. She told her that there were 2 children from the relationship, living in Hertfordshire under the surname Stewart, who were not generally known of in the family. She told her niece that Granville had informed her of his intention to propose marriage to Harry-O, and that Henrietta was prepared to consent to the match, and that she had felt her niece had a right to hear the truth from her aunt directly before any proposal was made, rather than hear it later from the lover she would by then have committed herself to. She told her, finally, that she would understand entirely if Harry-O wished to refuse the proposal in the light of what she had now been told, and that there would be no hard feelings between them whatever Harry-O decided. Harry-O did not, by her own subsequent account, weep during the conversation either. She listened, in the careful Cavendish way she had learned from her own difficult upbringing, and she asked her aunt several questions. She asked whether the affair was over. Henrietta said it was over in the physical sense, and would, after the marriage, be over in every sense except correspondence. She asked whether Granville knew her aunt was telling her these things. Henrietta said yes. She asked whether the 2 children would be a continuing presence in Granville's life. Henrietta said yes, that he would always provide for them, but that they would not be acknowledged publicly and would not interfere with any legitimate household Granville established. Harry-O thanked her aunt for the honesty. She said she would think about it. She left. She did, in the event, accept Granville's proposal when it came, 3 weeks later, She did so in the full knowledge of what had been her aunt's relationship with the man she was marrying. She told no one in the Cavendish family what she had been told by her aunt, because she had decided, in the careful weighing she did between the moment of the August conversation and the moment of the September acceptance, that the family's reception of the match would not be served by full disclosure. She kept her aunt's confidence. She married Granville at the Duke and Bess's house on Piccadilly on Christmas Eve 1809, in a private ceremony attended by the Cavendish family and by Henrietta and the Countess. Henrietta watched her niece marry her lover. She did not weep at the wedding. She kissed the bride. She left with her mother in the carriage afterwards, and she returned to Cavendish Square and to the resumption of the rest of her life. The astonishing thing about the next decade, the thing that surprised even the people closest to all three of the participants, was how successfully the new arrangement was made to work. Harry O proved to be exactly the wife Granville needed. Intelligent, calm, devoted, possessed of the diplomatic sensibilities her aunt had recognized in her since girlhood. The marriage was, by every account, a happy one. They had 5 children together over the following years. Harry O managed the household with the same quiet competence Henrietta had brought to her own. Granville continued to write to Henrietta. The letters were no longer love letters in the previous sense, but they were the warm, intelligent correspondence of 2 people who had loved each other and who had, by mutual sacrifice and mutual generosity, transformed the love into something that could survive Granville's marriage. Harry O knew of the correspondence. Harry O permitted the correspondence. Harry O herself, in time, began to correspond with her aunt with the same affection she had always had, and the 2 women maintained, for the rest of Henrietta's life, the close confidential friendship that had been the central female bond of Harry O's adult life. The 3 of them, Granville, Harry O and Henrietta, formed in the years between 1810 and 1821 a triangulation as strange and as functional as the Devonshire House triangle of 2 decades earlier, with the same generosity and the same private cost. Henrietta paid the higher price. Henrietta had given up her lover to her niece. The niece and the lover had received by that gift the marriage they had needed. Henrietta had been the central figure of the transaction and the principal beneficiary of none of its outcomes. She had also, by her honesty in the conversation of August 1809, given Harry O the gift of marrying in full knowledge rather than in deception, and the gift had paid itself back across the years in the daughter-like devotion her niece showed her in the long final decade. The other figure of the late period, the one Henrietta could not manage with the same generosity because the difficulty did not permit it, was her own daughter Caroline. The Lamb marriage continued to deteriorate across 1810 and 1811. William Lamb became progressively more remote. Caroline became progressively more erratic. The disabled child George Augustus was a constant grief without the compensation of his being able to respond to his mother in the ways she needed. Caroline began, in the early months of 1812, to spend her evenings at the parties of a slightly faster set than her mother had previously frequented, and the parties she attended in the spring of that year included one at Holland House, at which the most famous young poet in England was also present. His name was George Gordon Byron. He was 24 years old. He had returned the previous summer from a 2-year Mediterranean tour. He had published in February 1812 the first 2 cantos of a long autobiographical poem called Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, which had become an immediate sensation, and he had been, in the 3 months since its publication, the most fashionable male figure in London. Women of every age had been throwing themselves at him at every party he attended. He had a club foot. He had a beautiful face. He had a reputation, just beginning to develop, for emotional intensity and physical attractiveness in roughly equal measure. He had a particular dark glamour that the period responded to in a way it had not previously responded to any single literary figure. Caroline met him at Lady Westmoreland's party in March 1812. She refused, on first sight, to be introduced to him, on the grounds that she had heard enough about his reputation and did not wish to encounter him in person. She wrote the famous remark in her diary that night, "He is mad, bad, and dangerous to know." She also wrote in the same diary entry that he had the most beautiful pale face she had ever seen. By the end of the following week, she had reversed her decision and had arranged to meet him. He came to Melbourne House. They began the affair within days. It lasted, in its intense first phase, perhaps 4 months. It was conducted with no discretion whatever. Caroline wrote Byron letters of impassioned intensity that he showed to his friends. He wrote her letters in return that she preserved in a locked box. She visited him at his rooms in St. James's. He came to Melbourne House openly. The whole of fashionable London noticed within weeks. The whole of fashionable London began, within weeks of noticing, to talk. Henrietta heard of it almost at once. She had been told by Lady Holland in early April that Caroline was being talked of in connection with the poet, and she had spoken to Caroline directly within days. Caroline, with the impulsive openness that her temperament had not been able to manage even in adolescence, told her mother the full truth of the affair. Henrietta was horrified. She was horrified for several reasons that overlapped each other in the careful private accounting of her own letters of the period. She was horrified that Caroline was being talked of in the public way that ruined women's reputations. She was horrified that the marriage to William Lamb, already strained, would not survive a public scandal of this magnitude. She was horrified, in a deeper way that she did not, in any letter that survives, name directly by the structural resemblance between her daughter's affair and her own the older married woman, the considerably younger lover, the secret correspondence that everyone was beginning to know about. She had conducted her own affair with 13 years of discretion. Her daughter was conducting hers with no discretion at all. Henrietta saw, in the spring of 1812, the public mirror version of the private life she had managed to keep private for nearly 2 decades, and she saw it being conducted by her own daughter with the absolute incompetence of someone who had never been taught the skills her mother had been taught. She tried to manage the situation. She wrote to William Lamb. She wrote to Lady Melbourne, Caroline's mother-in-law, who was also Byron's confidant, and who would, by the late summer of 1812, be the person who effectively ended the affair on Byron's side. She wrote to her own brother George Spencer for support. She brought Caroline to Cavendish Square and tried in the small upstairs sitting room to reason with her daughter about the cost of the affair. Caroline was not, in any meaningful sense, reachable in those weeks. She was in the manic flush of her first serious romantic obsession. She would not be reasoned with. She told her mother, in the conversation, that her marriage was unhappy, and that Byron loved her, and that she would do as she pleased. Henrietta returned home from the conversation and wept again in her sitting room, with the same housekeeper bringing tea, in the same chair where she had sat after Granville's August conversation 3 years earlier. The affair ended, on Byron's side, in August 1812. He had grown tired of Caroline's intensity. He had been counselled by Lady Melbourne, who was a woman of considerable practical intelligence, to extract himself before further public damage was done. He extracted himself. Caroline did not accept the ending. She pursued him for the next several years in the most public possible manner, turning up at parties he was attending, writing letters that grew increasingly unhinged. On one famous occasion in 1813, cutting herself at a ball in his presence, in a way that became, within hours, the gossip of every London drawing-room. She wrote a novel in 1816, after Byron had married and separated and gone into exile, called Glenarvan, in which she portrayed her former lover as the villain of a Gothic romance, and which was, within weeks of its publication, the talk of every reading society in England. The novel made her briefly a literary figure in her own right. It also made her, more permanently, a social figure of ridicule. The public would never again take her seriously. She had ceased, by 1816, to be received in any of the great houses she had grown up visiting. She had become, in the language of the period, Henrietta watched her daughter become impossible. She continued to love her. She continued to receive her at Cavendish Square. She continued to write to her with the same careful affection she had always written to her. She also, in the privacy of her own letters to Granville across the years 1813 to 1820, expressed a grief about Caroline that she did not express in any other context. Caroline was, she wrote in 1815, the child she could no longer help, and the love she gave the child was now a love that could only be given without expectation of return. Caroline herself, in the rare lucid periods of those years, understood that her mother had been the steadiest presence of her adult life. She wrote her own grateful letters in the calm intervals. She apologized, in writing, for the public scenes. She would, in the years after Henrietta's death, mourn her mother as the only person who had ever fully understood her. The mourning would come too late to do either of them any good. The damage to the mother had been done over the years of the storm. The damage to the daughter would not be repaired in the remaining years of her own life. The years between 1813 and 1820 were the strangely settled years of Henrietta's late middle life. She was, at 52 in 1813, the senior surviving woman of her Spencer generation. Her sister had been dead for 7 years. Her own marriage had reached a state of mutual courteous coexistence with her husband that did not require either of them to expect more of the other. Her affair with Granville had been transmuted into the long, careful correspondence of a woman of 50, a man of 40 who had loved each other and who now loved each other in a different and quieter way. Her elder sons were grown men with their own establishments. Her younger son had entered Parliament. Her daughter was the family's public catastrophe. Her 2 hidden children were nearing adulthood. Her mother, the formidable Countess, lived in close practical alliance with her until her death at 76 in 1814. Her niece, the Lady Granville of the eventual public scandal she had not produced, was the closest female friend of her late life. She was, by every measure, a tired woman. The Naples stroke of 1792 had left effects that did not lift. Her right hand, in her 50s, was visibly less capable than her left. Her speech, on tired days, was halting in the way it had been in the first weeks after the stroke, with the same difficulty finding words mid-sentence. She slept poorly. She rose late. She conducted her social life at half the pace she had conducted it in her 30s and 40s. She no longer attended large parties as a matter of course. She accepted only a small fraction of the invitations she received. She wrote, in a letter to Granville in 1815 from St. Petersburg, where he was again ambassador, that she had become at 54 the kind of woman who was happiest in her own drawing room with 2 friends and a fire, and that she did not entirely regret it. What she did continue to do, with the steady competence that had been her hallmark across her whole life, was manage the small ongoing business of the extended Spencer Ponsonby family. She corresponded with her 2 elder sons about the estates they would inherit. She corresponded with her younger son about his parliamentary career. She corresponded, in increasingly painful exchanges, with her daughter Caroline in the post-Byron years of progressive instability. She corresponded with her niece Harry O, now Lady Granville, about the raising of the 5 Granville children. She corresponded with Granville himself in the diplomatic postings that took him to St. Petersburg twice and then to Paris. She corresponded with the 2 hidden children, Harriet and George Stuart, who were by then 16 and 14, and who were beginning to ask, in their letters to her and to Granville, the kinds of questions about their parentage that the time was approaching at which they would have to be answered. Harriet, in particular, was a serious concern. She had grown up in the clergyman's family in Hertfordshire with the understanding that she was the ward of distant relations. She had been told as a teenager that her real parents were people of position who could not openly acknowledge her, and she had absorbed the partial knowledge without pressing for more. By 1815 she was 15 and beginning to consider the question of her own marriage prospects, which her ambiguous status made considerably complicated. Granville and Henrietta agreed, in correspondence across that year, that Harriet would need to be given a substantial dowry, a respectable connection, and as much honest information as the circumstances would permit. The dowry was arranged. The connection to a discreet country gentleman of Granville's acquaintance was developed. The information, however, would have to wait. Henrietta did not feel, in 1815 or 1816 or 1817, that she could give her daughter the full truth of her parentage, while she herself was still alive and married to a man who did not know the daughter existed. Granville agreed. Harriet continued in her partial knowledge. She would not be told the full truth until after her mother's death. The boy George Stuart was a quieter case. He had developed into a steady, studious adolescent with a clear inclination toward a military career, and Granville had begun the practical arrangements for his commission. The boy would in time serve respectably in the army, and would in his middle years marry quietly and produce children who would themselves become respectable members of the country gentry. Neither of the 2 hidden children would ever rise to public position. Neither would ever be openly acknowledged in their parents' lifetime. Granville would, after Henrietta's death, and with Harry-O's full knowledge and consent, eventually inform them of the full truth of their parentage, and would maintain a relationship with them, of the kind he had been unable to maintain openly during their mother's life. The acknowledgement would come too late for Henrietta to witness. She would die not having said to her children what she had wanted for 20 years to say to them. Bessborough, in these late years, was a quieter husband than he had been. He had aged into the role of an Irish earl in his late 50s and early 60s with what looked, from the outside, like considerable dignity. He managed the Irish estates with attention. He took his seat in the Lords when he was in London. He had ceased, by the middle years of the new century, to drink in the dangerous quantities of his 30s, and he had ceased, almost entirely, the displays of jealous temper that had been the central difficulty of the marriage's early decades. Henrietta and he lived by the 1810s in the steady, distant partnership of an aristocratic couple who had borne their children together, who had buried their parents together, who managed their estates together, and who did not, in the deeper sense, share a life. They did not, by the late period, share a bedroom. They did not, by the late period, share any considerable portion of their private hours. They shared the household. They shared the public face of the marriage. They shared the table at dinner when they were both at home. It was sufficient. It was by the calculus of Henrietta's careful religious accounting, a respectable marriage of a kind she had not expected at 30, but had learned to value at 50. She did, in those years, develop a small late warmth toward her husband that surprised her own observers. He had, by 1815, become a man whose principal social pleasure was his garden at the Roehampton house, where he had begun a serious interest in the cultivation of rare camellias under the influence of a friend who had imported the first such plants from Japan. Henrietta, who had her own quiet pleasure in gardens, came to share this interest. They would walk together in the Roehampton garden in the late afternoons of summer days, with the slow, careful pace of a couple of their age, and would discuss the progress of the camellias and the weather, and the prospects for the year's bloom. It was, by the standards of their earlier married life, a startling tenderness. Henrietta wrote of it to Granville in 1816, in a letter that survives, with a slightly bemused gratitude. My husband and I find ourselves after 35 years of marriage friends. The framing was careful. The framing was also true. They had become friends in the small, undramatic way of two people who had lived in the same house for a long time, and who had, in late middle age, learned to take the small pleasures together that the marriage's early years had not permitted them. The Countess died in March 1814 at the age of 76 at her own house at St. Albans, with Henrietta at her bedside. The death was peaceful in the manner of a long-expected ending. The Countess had been failing for some time. She had been by the end frail and partially blind, but still mentally clear. She had given Henrietta, in the last week of her life, the small pieces of practical advice the family elder typically gives the new family elder instructions about the management of various trusts, recommendations about how to handle Caroline, suggestions about Granville's continuing place in Henrietta's life. She had been, on the day she died, in a state of quiet readiness for the end. She had told Henrietta in the morning that she was ready, and that she was grateful for the life she had been given, and that she trusted her daughter to manage the family in the years to come. She had then slept. She had died in the late afternoon with Henrietta holding her hand. Henrietta was 53. She had been her mother's daughter for 53 years. The orienting fact of her childhood had been the elder sister. The orienting fact of her adulthood had been, in many ways, the mother. The mother was now gone. Henrietta was, in the deepest structural sense, alone for the first time in her life. She missed her mother for the rest of her years. The Countess had been the figure to whom Henrietta had referred her own decisions in the inward accounting of her interior life. Would my mother approve? Would my mother understand? Would my mother forgive? The references continued after the Countess's death, but without the possibility of reply. Henrietta wrote in her journal in 1818, in a passage that survives, "I find myself, since Mamma's death, no longer entirely sure which of my own thoughts I can trust. I had her judgment to test mine against. I do not have it now. I do not yet know how to test my own judgment without her. The Spencer family in this period, in any case, undergoing the slow contraction that all generations undergo as their members age and die. Henrietta's brother George, the second Earl Spencer, was 60 in 1818 and beginning his own decline. He would die in 1834 at the age of 75. Her own sons were grown men. Her two younger boys had married. Her elder son William, who would be the third Earl of Bessborough, had not yet married. He would marry only in 1825, 4 years after his mother's death, a quiet match to a Scottish gentlewoman that produced no children and that left the earldom to pass eventually to his brother's descendants. Her youngest son John William would in time become himself an important Whig figure and the father of the Spencer-Compton Dukes of Devonshire, who would carry the family line into the Victorian period. The grandchildren, when they came, were a particular pleasure of her late years. Harry-O's eldest, Granville George, was born in 1812 and was christened with his Aunt Henrietta as a godmother, an arrangement that the Duke and Bess and Granville and Harry-O had agreed upon as the kind of formal symbolic acknowledgement that the strange family triangle had earned. Henrietta visited the Granville children at Warestead in Suffolk and at the various country houses they inhabited, and the children grew up knowing their Aunt Henrietta as a particular kind of presence, a quiet, slightly halting, deeply affectionate older woman whose visits were treats, and whose letters arrived with small enclosures of pressed flowers and embroidered handkerchiefs. The children loved her. She loved them. They were, in the symmetry the dynastic accident had constructed. The children she might have had with Granville had her circumstances permitted, and she gave them the maternal affection she had not been able to give to her own two illegitimate children, and the giving was the small late healing of the loss those years had inflicted on her. The publication of Caroline's novel Glenarvan in May 1816 had been the public catastrophe Henrietta had been dreading for 4 years. The book was, in the form it appeared in, a thinly veiled Roman eclef, in which Caroline herself appeared as the heroine Calantha, Byron as the villain Glenarvan, William Lamb as the unloved husband, and the entire Devonshire House and Melbourne House circles as the supporting cast under names so transparent that even the slowest reader of the period could decode them within 20 pages. The book was a publishing sensation. It went into 3 editions within the first 6 weeks. It was reviewed in every paper and quarterly journal in London. It was the subject of dinner-table conversation in every great house in the country. Caroline, in the first weeks after publication, was triumphant. She believed, in the brief mania of the launch, that she had at last produced the work that would establish her as a literary figure in the manner of Madame de Staël. She was wrong. The book's reception, after the first weeks of sensation, turned. The literary reviewers who had initially been entertained began to dismiss it as the work of an unstable woman writing about her own affairs. The social reviewers, who had initially been gossipy, began to be openly hostile. The figures Caroline had portrayed in the book began, one by one, to close their doors to her. Lady Holland, who had been one of Caroline's hostesses through her young womanhood, refused to receive her after July 1816 and would not receive her again. The Cavendish family at Devonshire House, who had appeared in the book in the persons of the Duke and the new Duchess, formally indicated that Lady Caroline Lamb would not be welcome at their house in the future. The Melbournes themselves, who had appeared most damagingly of all in the book in the form of Lady Margaret, the unloving mother-in-law, conducted a quiet private rupture with Caroline that became, by the autumn of 1816, a public estrangement. Henrietta read the book on the day of its publication. She read it again the following day. She wrote to her daughter on the third day, in a letter that survives in the Lamb papers, and that is among the most painful letters Henrietta ever composed. She wrote in the slow, careful style her stroke had left her with on her hardest days. She told her daughter that she had read the book with the attention any mother would bring to her own child's first novel. She told her she could, in the writing, the brilliance of her daughter's intelligence and the depth of her daughter's wounds. She told her also, in language that did not flinch from what had to be said, that the book had done damage to her daughter herself, that the daughter had not foreseen and would not be able to repair. She told her that the social world Caroline had grown up inside would, within months, be effectively closed to her, and that the closure would be permanent. She told her, finally, that she loved her daughter and would always love her, and that whatever else happened, the door at Cavendish Square would always be open to her. The letter ended without a request, without a recrimination, and without any of the sermonizing that Caroline had grown to expect from the older generation. It ended simply with the assurance of the open door. Caroline received the letter at Brocket Hall. She read it. She did not, by her own subsequent account in her diary, weep when she read it. She did, however, write a reply that has not survived, in which she apparently said something that Henrietta later described, in a letter to Granville, as the most affecting acknowledgment she had ever received from her daughter. The acknowledgment did not, in any practical sense, alter Caroline's behaviour. The pattern of her erratic public conduct continued. She made small public scenes through the rest of 1816 and into 1817. She would write further novels, Graham Hamilton in 1822, Ada Rice in 1823, that would receive progressively less attention, and that would not restore her literary standing. She would, by the period of her mother's death, be a social ghost, received nowhere in fashionable London except at her parents' house and at her own husband's establishments, and even there with the careful management that an unstable family member requires. The Lambs' formal separation was deferred for years beyond the point at which the marriage had become unworkable, principally because William Lamb refused to undertake the legal proceedings that would have been required, and because Caroline, in her erratic way, would not accept the principle of separation when it was suggested. They lived, from approximately 1815 onward, in nominally separate establishments, Caroline at Brocket Hall in the country with the disabled son and a small staff, William in his bachelor rooms in London and at his parents' Melbourne house. They saw each other at intervals. The marriage continued, in the unusual form the period sometimes permitted, on the strength of William's stubborn refusal to allow it to be ended. Henrietta, who had hoped at one point that a clean separation might allow her daughter to recover some equilibrium, came eventually to understand that William's refusal was the surest protection Caroline had. The legal status of his wife was, for Caroline, the last thread of social standing remaining to her, and any clean dissolution would have removed that thread and exposed her to a deeper isolation than even the Glenavon period had produced. Henrietta visited Brocket Hall regularly in those years. She would go up by carriage with a single attendant and stay for 3 or 4 days at a time. The visits were the strangest experience of her late life. Brocket Hall was a fine Hertfordshire house of considerable size, set in parkland that had been laid out in the previous century. Caroline lived in it with the practical minimum of staff: a housekeeper, a cook, 2 maids, a manservant for the disabled child, a single governess who attempted, in the periods when Caroline's mental state permitted, to give the boy what limited instruction he could absorb. The house was on Henrietta's visits often visibly neglected rooms unaired, fires unlit, meals served late, the day's correspondence unopened on the hall table. Caroline herself, in the periods of relative calm, would receive her mother with delighted affection, and would tour her through the gardens, and would play the pianoforte for her in the evenings, and would seem in those brief intervals almost the daughter Henrietta had hoped to see. The intervals never lasted. By the second day of any visit, the volatility would begin to surface. Caroline would weep about something, or pace the corridors at night, or appear at dinner in an outfit her mother considered eccentric, or speak about Byron in a way that her mother had been hoping she had at last left behind. Henrietta endured the visits with the patience that had been her hallmark across 40 years. She did not, by the testimony of any of the staff at Brocket Hall who survived to be interviewed by later biographers, ever lose her temper with her daughter on any of these visits. The disabled grandson, George Augustus, was Henrietta's particular concern in those years. The boy was, by 1818, 11 years old, and possessed of perhaps the comprehension of a child of 3 or 4. He could speak a few words. He could recognize the few people who attended him regularly. He could not, in any sense, develop into the heir his parents had once hoped for. He loved his mother fiercely in his limited way, and Caroline, to her enduring credit, loved him fiercely in return. She would, in the manic phases of her later years, sometimes withdraw from every other connection she had, but she would never withdraw from her son. Henrietta watched the relationship between her daughter and her grandson with a complicated grief. The boy was the only consistent grace of his mother's late life. The boy was also, in his own person, a sorrow Caroline could not heal, and could not in any meaningful sense be helped to bear. Henrietta brought small presents on each visit, picture books the boy would never read, a small carved horse, a music box she had bought in St. James's Street. The boy treasured the presents in the way children of his condition treasured the few possessions they came to know as their own. Henrietta wrote to Granville in 1817 that the visits to Brocket left her with a particular kind of exhaustion she did not have a name for, but that she would continue to make them for as long as her health permitted, because her daughter had no one else. Granville himself was much abroad in those years. He had been appointed British ambassador to St. Petersburg for a second time in 1812, and had served there until 1815, when his recall and the post-Waterloo diplomatic settlement brought him home. He had been at the Vienna Congress in 1815. He had been appointed ambassador to The Hague in 1815. He had been sent to Brussels in 1816 to assist with the establishment of the new Kingdom of the Netherlands. He had returned home for an extended period in 1817 and 1818, during which time he and Harriot had lived principally at their country house at Wearstead in Suffolk, and had visited London frequently. In late 1818 he had been appointed ambassador to Paris, the most senior diplomatic post in the British service, and he and Harriot and their children had relocated to the embassy at the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré, where they would remain for most of the next 6 years. The Paris embassy under Granville and Harriot became, in the early years of the Restoration period, one of the central social institutions of Anglo-French intellectual life, and Granville himself rose to a position of considerable diplomatic eminence. The correspondence between him and Henrietta in those years was, in volume, the densest of their adult lives. He wrote to her, on average, twice a week from his various postings. She wrote to him with similar regularity. The letters had altered in tone from the love letters of the affair years into the long, intelligent correspondence of two people who had loved each other, and who had, by mutual choice, made the love into a different thing that could survive his marriage. They wrote about politics, they wrote about books, they wrote about the children, Harry-O's, the two hidden ones, and increasingly the grandchildren of Henrietta's own legitimate line. They wrote about mutual friends. They wrote about the long, slow changes in the political world after Waterloo, the rise of the new Tory administration under Liverpool, the conservatism that had followed the long war years. They wrote about each other's health. They did not, in any explicit sense, write about the past relationship. They had not needed to. The past was the foundation on which the present correspondence sat, and naming it directly would have been, by the careful conventions both of them had absorbed, a small breach of the dignity the new arrangement required. Harry-O knew about every letter. Henrietta and Granville had agreed, in the months after the 1809 marriage, that Harry-O would have access to the correspondence at any time she wished to read it, and that nothing would be written between them that Harry-O could not be permitted to see. The agreement was honoured. Harry-O exercised the access from time to time, but principally trusted her aunt and her husband to maintain the agreement, and the trust was, by every indication of the years, justified. The triangulation had become, by the late 1810s, the most successful unconventional household in the upper Whig family connection. The three of them functioned as a kind of distributed intellectual partnership, Henrietta in London providing the steady English connection, Granville in Paris providing the diplomatic centre, Harry-O providing the household around which the children grew and the wider social life unfolded. The grandchildren of the Granville household, who would in time produce their own distinguished line of Victorian diplomats and politicians, grew up knowing their Aunt Henrietta in the letters and the periodic visits, as one of the central beloved figures of their childhood. The annual visit Henrietta made to the Granville children in Paris was, in the years 1819 and 1820, the highlight of her year. She would go in the spring, when the weather permitted, with one trusted servant and the modest establishment a woman of her age and position required. She would stay at the embassy for 3 or 4 weeks. Harry-O received her with the warm domestic affection that had developed between them across the decade of the marriage. Granville received her with the measured intelligence that the relationship had settled into. The children loved her. She walked with Harry-O in the embassy gardens in the long afternoons of Paris spring. She played with the children in the private salon Harry-O had decorated for the family use. She conversed with Granville, in the evenings after the children had been put to bed, in the hesitant manner her stroke had left her with, and that Granville, who knew her speech better than anyone, could follow without difficulty. The visits were, by every contemporary account that survives, the late happiness of her life. She wrote to her brother George in 1820, after her return from the Paris visit of that spring, that she had been struck, on the journey home, by how strange a thing it was that the central pleasure of her 60s had become the household of the man she had loved as a younger woman and the niece she had given him to. She wrote, "I do not know, in any moral sense, whether I have arrived at the right place. I know only that the household I have just left is the household I most love in the world, and that I am loved in it more steadily than I have been loved by my own marriage. The peculiarity of this is not lost on me. The peculiarity of the whole long path that brought me to it is not lost on me either. I have lived a strange life, my dear brother, and I have, against the expectations of my younger self, found in it more affection than I had thought I was due. The letter survives in the Spencer papers and is among the most measured statements of her position that she made in her late years. Her other late occupations were the management of the family estates, which Bessborough increasingly delegated to her as his own energy diminished, and the patient preparation of the family papers for whatever future use historians might make of them. She had by 1818 begun a project of sorting her own correspondence into the categories the next generation would find useful. She kept Granville's letters in a set of locked boxes that would, on her death, pass to Harry O for whatever disposition she chose. Harry O would in turn pass them to her own daughter, and the bulk of Granville's correspondence with Henrietta would in time form one of the most important archives of Whig family papers from the period. Henrietta also sorted, in the late years, her correspondence with her sister Georgiana, which she had preserved across 40 years. She organized the letters by date, made brief explanatory notes in the margins, and prepared the collection for eventual deposit at Althorpe, where her brother George had been gathering the family papers since the Countess's death. The sorting was the patient work of a woman in her late 50s who had begun to consider the long historical record her family would in time become, and who wished to leave that record in as useful a state as her energies permitted. She also undertook in 1819 and 1820 a small undertaking that was for her own private satisfaction. She had begun, perhaps as early as 1815, a kind of unsystematic memoir of her own life, not for publication, which she would never have considered, but for the eyes of her own descendants should they wish in time to know what their grandmother and great-grandmother had thought of her own years. The memoir was not finished. It would never be finished. It survives in the Bessborough papers in fragments of perhaps 50 pages, written in the careful, slow hand the stroke had left her with, covering principally the childhood at Wimbledon Park and Althorpe, the early marriage, and the Naples winter. It does not extend to the years of the affair or the children or the catastrophes of the late life. The reasons it does not extend are partly that she did not have the time to complete it, and partly that she did not, in the careful private accounting of her religious training, feel that those years were her own to record in writing. She had told Granville, she had told her mother, she had told her niece. She had not told the historical record. The decision to keep the central events of her own life out of her own written memoir was the final piece of the discretion she had practiced for 30 years. The discretion would be honoured by her descendants. The full story of the affair would not be assembled in the historical sense until late in the 19th century, when Granville's grandson edited his grandfather's letters for publication, and the cumulative evidence became visible to readers who already by that point were 2 generations removed from the persons concerned. The catastrophe of Princess Charlotte of Wales's death in childbirth in November 1817, which I described in some detail in the Queen Charlotte's Son script, was a piece of public news that affected Henrietta as it affected every aristocratic woman in England. She had known Princess Charlotte from the latter's childhood, in the Devonshire house circle's incidental connections to the royal household. She had liked the princess. She wrote, in the weeks after the death, several letters of condolence to figures of the court connection, and she observed the formal court mourning that her position required. She had her own private mourning as well. The death of any young woman in childbirth touched the women of her generation in a way that the men of the same generation did not entirely register, because childbirth had been the central physical fact of every aristocratic woman's reproductive life, and the death of any of them in it was the materialization of a fear that every one of them had carried at some point. Henrietta had borne 5 children and survived all 5 labours. She had been lucky. She knew she had been lucky. Princess Charlotte had not been lucky. The princess's death, on top of the death of the Countess 3 years earlier, contributed to a general darkening of Henrietta's view of her own remaining years, and she began, by 1818, to write to Granville with a different tone, a tone of the woman who has begun to consider, more seriously than before, the possibility that her own time may be shorter than she had assumed. She was not seriously ill in 1818 or 1819 or 1820 in the sense of any specific diagnosed condition. She had, however, the accumulating small health difficulties of a woman in her late 50s who had been damaged at 30 and had not been able to lift the damage. She tired easily. She caught colds in the winter that took longer to clear than they had in her 40s. She had occasional palpitations that her physician described as nervous in origin, but that Henrietta herself, who knew her body better than her physician did, suspected was something more substantive. She had, in 1820, a fainting episode at her own dinner table that frightened her husband considerably and led him to propose gently that the two of them might consider a continental trip the following year, for her health and for the benefit of his own aging lungs, which his physician had suggested might do well with a warmer climate for a winter. She accepted the proposal. They would go to Italy. They would go in the late summer of 1821 and would spend the winter abroad, returning the following spring. They would travel slowly, with a small establishment of servants. They would visit the family connections at various of the courts they passed through. They would, by the proposal her husband had laid out, give her the same kind of restorative continental quiet that her mother had given her in 1791. She did not know, when she agreed to the journey, that she would not return from it. He did not know it either. The plan, as it was made in the late winter of 1820 and the spring of 1821, was the plan of a couple in their late 50s going abroad for the husband's lungs and the wife's general health, and there was no reason for any of those involved to consider it a final journey. She wrote to Granville in Paris, where he was then ambassador, in the spring of 1821, telling him of the planned journey. She mentioned that she hoped to visit him in Paris on the way out and again on the way back, and that she looked forward particularly to seeing Harry-O and the grandchildren. She wrote also, in the same letter, a particular paragraph that has been much quoted by later biographers, in which she said, "I have begun to feel, in this year that has begun, that the time I have remaining will not be very long. I do not say this in any spirit of self-pity, but only because I have been making my private accounts in a manner I have not done before, and the accounts have left me with the sense that I should not delay any business I had been delaying. I have not been a very accomplished woman, my dear friend, but I have on the whole been a faithful one to those I have loved, to the duties I was given, to the quiet convictions I have not, except in the matters concerning you, been able to act upon. I write this to you now in case I find I cannot write it later. You have been the centre of my interior life for 25 years. I shall continue to write to you for as long as I am able. But I wanted you to know, before any further deterioration, that I have known every year of those 25 what you have given me, and that I have been more grateful than I have ever quite been able to say. The letter survives in the Granville papers. It is among the most precise statements of her position that Henrietta ever made. It was written in May 1821. She would live another 6 months. She would die on the 11th of November of that year, in Florence, in the small first-floor sitting room of the apartments her husband had taken for them on the Lung'Arno. The journey to Italy began in late August 1821. Henrietta and Bessborough and a small staff of servants left Roehampton in 2 carriages and proceeded by easy stages to Dover, and then across the Channel to Calais, and then by post-chaise through northern France. They reached Paris in the 2nd week of September. They stayed there for 10 days. Granville and Hariot received them at the British Embassy with the warmth that had become by then the warmth of family, and the Granville children, by then ranging in age from 9 years old down to 2, were brought to greet their aunt with the enthusiasm of children who had been told that their Aunt Henrietta was a particular treat. Henrietta spent her 10 days in Paris in the company of the Granville household. She walked with Hariot in the embassy gardens. She had several long conversations alone with Granville in his study behind a closed door, with the discreet permission of his wife. The conversations have not survived. Granville, in a letter to Hariot some years after Henrietta's death, would say that what they discussed in those Paris hours was their 2 children, and the eventual question of telling those children the truth of their parentage, and that Henrietta had asked him, in particular, to ensure that the children were told kindly when the time came, and that they were given the comfort, from him at least, of the parental acknowledgement she had not been able to give them in her own life. The Bessboroughs left Paris in the 3rd week of September. They proceeded by way of Lyon and the Alpine passes to Turin and then on through Lombardy and Tuscany. They reached Florence in mid-October, somewhat later than they had planned, because Henrietta's health on the journey had required several extended stops. They settled into apartments on the Lung'Arno that Bessborough had taken for the winter, a fine set of rooms on the 1st floor of a Florentine palazzo with views of the Arno and access to the small garden behind. They began the slow business of arranging themselves for the winter. They engaged local servants. They met the small British community of Florence, which included several family connections and several diplomatic acquaintances. They attended 1 or 2 of the receptions that the British community held in the early autumn. Henrietta wrote to Granville in late October that she was tired from the journey but slowly recovering, and that the Florentine climate was pleasant, and that she expected to be more herself by the middle of November. She was not. The deterioration began in the first days of November. She developed what her physician initially treated as a chill on the lungs, a low fever, a difficulty in breathing, a general weakness that confined her to her rooms. The physician applied the standard treatments of the period, which were a mixture of bleeding and warming and the administration of mild herbal preparations. The treatments did not arrest the progress. By the 7th of November, Henrietta was confined to her bed. By the 9th, she was struggling to speak. By the 10th, she was no longer entirely lucid. The physician, by then in consultation with a second Florentine doctor, informed Bessborough that he did not believe his wife would recover. Bessborough sent immediate word to Paris, by the swiftest courier the British minister at Florence could provide, asking the Granvilles to come at once. The courier left Florence on the morning of the 10th. The journey to Paris was at least 8 days even in the best conditions of the autumn roads. Granville and Hariot could not, even at the fastest pace they could manage, reach Florence before the 20th of the month at the earliest. They left Paris within hours of receiving the news. They would arrive too late. Henrietta died on the morning of the 11th of November 1821 in the small first-floor sitting room of the Lungano apartments, with her husband holding her hand and the Italian physician standing by the window in the slow grey light of a Florence morning in November. She was 60 years old. She had been awake intermittently during the last night. She had spoken, when she had spoken, of her mother and of Georgiana, in the soft, fragmentary way of people in the last hours, and she had asked her husband, in one of the brief, clearer intervals, whether he had written to Granville, and her husband had told her yes, and she had nodded and closed her eyes again. She had spoken, in another interval, the name of her daughter, Caroline. She had spoken, in a final interval, simply the word water, and her husband had given her a small spoonful, and she had taken it, and she had not spoken again. Her last hour was quiet. She died in the slow, steady way of women who have been dying for some weeks rather than the sudden way of those who have been killed by a single event. She slipped, by the careful description of the Italian doctor's notes, into a deepening unconsciousness, and then ceased to breathe. The household at Florence was thrown immediately into the formal arrangements that a death abroad required. The Italian authorities had to be notified, the British minister had to be informed, the body had to be prepared for the journey home. The Florence climate would not permit a long delay before either burial in Italy or embalming for transport. Bessborough, in the practical shock of a 60-year-old husband whose wife had been alive at the start of the week and was dead at the end of it, made the decisions a man in his position had to make. He arranged for the body to be embalmed, in the manner the period employed for the long journeys of the dead, and for the slow eventual transport home to England, where Henrietta would be buried in the family vault at Cavendish Square. He wrote, in the afternoon of the 11th, the necessary letters to Granville and Harry O. on the road, to his sons in England, to the Countess's surviving brothers, to the few intimate friends of the family who would need to know directly rather than through the newspapers. The Granvilles arrived in Florence on the 22nd of November. They came to the Lungano apartments. They found Bessborough sitting in the sitting room where Henrietta had died, in the heavy stupor of grief that a husband of his sort can sometimes fall into when the wife he had loved imperfectly across 4 decades has unexpectedly been taken from him. Granville and Harry O. sat with him through the afternoon. They walked, in the late afternoon light, with him in the garden behind the palazzo. They observed with him the private rites that the period afforded to mourners. Granville himself, by Harry O.'s later muted testimony in a letter to her sister, did not weep during the visit, but became, in the days he spent at Florence in the company of his wife and his wife's uncle by marriage, a man who had been visibly altered by the loss in a way Harry O. had not previously seen. The body was brought home to England in the following weeks. The journey was long. The coffin reached London in late January 1822. The funeral was held privately at Cavendish Square, in the manner of the period for aristocratic women whose families did not desire public ceremony. Henrietta was buried in the Ponsonby family vault. The funeral was attended by her husband, by her 4 legitimate children, by her surviving brother, by the Duke and Bess of Devonshire, by Granville and Harry O., by the extended Spencer Cavendish Ponsonby connection. The 2 hidden children, Harriet and George Stuart, were not present. Granville, who alone of those present knew that they should have been, wept openly during the burial service, in a manner that the rest of the family attributed to his particular affection for Henrietta, and that Harry O, who knew, understood for what it was. The aftermath of the death played out, in the family that survived her, in the various ways that aftermaths play out. Bessborough lived another 23 years, dying in 1844 at the age of 86, having never remarried and having ended his life in slow retirement at Roehampton with his camellias and his memories. The two elder sons, William and Frederick, inherited their father's title and estates in due course. Frederick had been wounded at Waterloo in 1815 and would die in 1837 of complications from those wounds. The younger son, John William, would become a senior Whig politician of the Victorian period and would in time receive the earldom of Bessborough on his elder brother's death. The daughter Caroline lived until 1828, dying at Melbourne House at the age of 42, after a slow decline that had been visible in her since the Glenavon period. She was attended at her death by William Lamb, who had remained nominally married to her throughout the 8 years since her mother's funeral, and who would in time become Prime Minister and the close adviser to the young Queen Victoria. Granville lived another 25 years until 1846. He was created Viscount Granville in 1815 and Earl Granville in 1833. He continued in diplomatic service through the long peace, and would in his final years be the Whig grandee elder statesman of his generation. Harry O survived him by another 16 years, dying in 1862 at 77, with her position as the keeper of the family papers having earned her, in late life, a reputation as one of the most acute female intelligences of her time. The two hidden children, Harriet and George Stuart, were informed of their parentage by Granville in the spring of 1822, with Harry O's full knowledge and support. Harriet married respectably and produced children. George served in the army and produced his own family in due course. Neither rose to public position, and the line they founded passed into the quiet country gentry where it remains, in some surviving branches, to the present day. Georgiana, the elder sister, had been dead since 1806. Henrietta had outlived her by 15 years and 7 months. The Duchess's story, the famous one, had ended at 48 with the brilliant cataclysm of a public life lived at the peak of fashion. Henrietta's story, the quieter one, had ended at 60 in a Florence hotel room with her husband holding her hand. The two sisters had been born 4 years apart at Wimbledon Park. The two sisters had shared a nursery and a schoolroom, and the long parallel education of the 18th century Spencer daughters. The two sisters had stepped, within 6 years of each other, into the marriages the period had assigned them. They had each, in their different ways, lived through the unfolding consequences. They had each loved without the marriage they had taken being the love. They had each borne children they could not entirely raise. They had each, by the long working of their position, been the kind of woman the period most romanticized and most failed. One of them the public remembered. The other it forgot. The forgetting was, in the deeper accounting, not entirely fair. The sister who was forgotten had lived the harder and the longer life. She had borne more. She had given more. She had received less. She had been, in the quiet inward way her religious upbringing had given her the language for, the more steadily faithful of the two to her difficult husband, to her younger lover, to her demanding children, to her own slowly accumulating sense of what she had been put on earth to do. She had done it. She had done it for 60 years. The doing had cost her health, her hand, her voice, and the daily mothering of 2 of her children. The cost had not been visible to most of the world. She had not made it visible. She had not asked for it to be visible. The papers she left have not, in the 2 centuries since her death, given her up easily. The bulk of her correspondence, the letters to Granville across 25 years, the letters to her sister across the years they had together, the letters to her mother across the long years of the Countess's life, the letters to her niece across the years of the strange triangular household, passed first to Harry O on Henrietta's death, and were kept by her at the Granville Embassy in Paris, and afterwards at the Granville country house in Surrey. Harry O sorted them in her widowhood. With the careful editorial attention she had been raised to bring to family papers, and she did not permit the most intimate of them to be read by anyone outside the family during her own lifetime. She died in 1862, and the letters passed to her own children. Granville II, who became the 3rd Earl Granville and was the diplomat of his generation in the manner his father had been the diplomat of the previous one, inherited the bulk of his father's papers and held them through the last decades of the 19th century. He published in 1894 a selection of his father's correspondence in 2 volumes, edited with the discretion of a Victorian grandson editing a Georgian grandfather. The affair with Henrietta was acknowledged in muted form. The children were not named. The most painful passages of the long correspondence were omitted. The volumes appeared. The reading public of the late Victorian period received them with interest. A small attentive readership noticed, in the gaps and the cautious phrasings, that the published letters were only part of the story. The fuller story would emerge in fragments across the next century. A grandniece of Harry O's, the Countess Granville of the early 20th century, gave access to a small number of additional letters to a biographer in 1916, who produced a slim, sympathetic study that was the first scholarly attempt to assemble Henrietta's life in something resembling its actual shape. The same biographer's work was extended in the 1930s by a more thorough scholar who tracked down letters in the Bessborough archive at Roehampton and in the Spencer archive at Althorpe and in the Devonshire archive at Chatsworth, and produced a fuller biography in 1940 that established the basic chronology of the affair, the children, and the 1809 catastrophe. The 2 children, by then long dead Harriet Stewart, had died in 1873. George Stewart in 1856 had left descendants who had grown up knowing their family history within the limits of what their parents had felt able to tell them, and the descendants cooperated with the biographer to the extent that they could without exposing collateral relatives to embarrassment. The 1940 biography appeared in a small print run. It was read by the kind of person who reads such books. It did not, in any substantial sense, alter the public memory of Henrietta, who remained, in the popular sense, the sister of the Duchess of Devonshire, and not much more. The full release of the papers came only in the 1990s, when the relevant family archives opened the Bessborough correspondence to scholars without restriction, and when the Spencer papers at Althorpe were catalogued in a manner that permitted serious research. A new generation of historians, working with feminist tools the earlier biographers had not had access to, produced across the 1990s and 2000s a series of books and articles that established Henrietta as a figure of independent interest, not merely Georgiana's sister, but a woman whose own correspondence was of considerable literary and historical importance in its own right. The letters she had written to Granville were finally published in full in a scholarly edition in 1996. The letters between her and her mother were published in 2003. The letters between her and her sister were published in 2008. The reading public who paid attention to such things began, slowly, to register that the quieter sister had left behind a body of writing that was, in the simple measure of pages and words, larger than the body of writing left behind by the famous sister, and was in the harder measure of what could be learned from it about the experience of a particular kind of woman in a particular kind of century, the more substantial archive of the two. That is where the record stands at the present moment. Henrietta is, in the early 21st century, a figure of growing scholarly attention and largely unaltered popular obscurity. The biographies that have appeared in the last 20 years have been serious. The novelists who have used her as a character have been respectful. The film adaptations of Georgiana's story have included her as a secondary figure played by capable actresses who have, in the limited time the script gave them, conveyed something of what she carried. The full public memory of her, however, remains the partial memory the 18th century arrangement of fame had constructed, and the partial memory may be permanent because the world's attention has a long-established preference for the brilliant sister over the steadier one, and the preference does not, by any historical evidence, reverse itself easily. What we have, in place of public memory, is the archive she left, the letters in their boxes, the portraits, the few that exist, painted by Reynolds and by Romney in the years when she was young enough to be considered worth painting, and then less and less frequently as she aged into the position of the family's quiet elder. The fragmentary memoir she had begun in her last years and had not finished. The few household objects that survived the various dispersals of the Ponsonby estates, a writing desk now in a private collection in Wiltshire, a small mother-of-pearl card case at the Victoria and Albert, a set of pearl earrings worn at her wedding that descended through her younger son's line, and that surfaced briefly at a Christie's auction in 1987 before disappearing again into private hands. These are the physical traces. They are not many by the standard of what the same period preserved of more famous women, but they are sufficient to allow the person who looks closely to recover something of the figure who used them, and that recovery is, in the patient, long work of historical memory, the kind of recovery that has to be sufficient. Somewhere in the histories of every great family you have ever heard of, and every family you have not, there is a sister who lived the less observed version of a more famous sibling's life. The famous one is the one we know the name of. The other one is, almost always, the more interesting of the two. The famous sister gets the portraits and the biographies and the dramatic recountings of the dramatic events. The shadowed sister gets a paragraph in the family tree, if she gets that. She has, in the patient accounting of her own years, lived through the same world the famous one lived through, and has done so without the consolation of being noticed, and has borne the same difficulties without the cushioning of the public's attention, and has often borne them with a more sustained and a more thoughtful discipline than the famous sister, who has had her difficulties witnessed and recorded, has been able to bring to her own. I would love to know, wherever you are listening from tonight, if there is such a sister in your own family memory, the aunt who outlived her brilliant elder, the mother who was, in childhood, the second daughter of a famous beauty, the grandmother who carried the unobserved end of her generation's family story alone for 20 years after the brilliant one had gone. The history of the 18th century, and of every century before and since, is full of these women. The famous sisters get the films and the novels and the museum exhibitions. The other ones do not. The other ones are, however, the steadier achievement of every generation, the women who managed difficult marriages and raised difficult children and loved without the marriages they were in, and who did so without notice and without complaint and without the consolation of being remembered. Tonight has been for one of them. There will be others in nights to come who will be the subjects of other evenings. There will not, in any sweep of history, be the full accounting of all of them. The world's memory does not work that way. Thank you as ever for spending the evening with me and for sitting through the long story of a less remembered sister whose life had a particular kind of difficulty and a particular kind of dignity. If you have enjoyed tonight's script, the kindest thing you can do for the channel is to subscribe so that you do not miss the next one, and to leave the video playing on autoplay through the night, which is what helps these scripts find the other listeners who would like to find them. Sleep well, wherever you are. Hold the people who are still in your life a little more attentively tomorrow. The unremembered siblings in particular deserve the noticing. The famous ones already have it. Good night.